Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs, and welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, the only channel where bedtime stories aren't soft lullabies, but instead long, winding reminders that history was far darker, stranger, and sometimes much pettier than your professors ever dared to admit. If you thought senators were the noble fathers of Rome, selfless men draped in spotless togas and lost in philosophical debates, you might want to grab a pillow, because tonight we'll pull back the marble curtain and peek into the sticky, wine-soaked mess of what it really meant to live as an ancient Roman senator. Spoiler, it was less about high ideals and more about how many enemies you could outlast without being stabbed in the forum or conveniently accused of treason over dinner. So, let's begin at the beginning. How did one even become a senator? Forget meritocracy, forget democracy, and forget the idea that brilliance or good intentions carried you upwards. The Roman Senate was a club, and like all exclusive clubs, it had rules that were less about fairness and more about whether your father had enough money to buy half a province. In theory, you climbed the cursus honorum, the ladder of political offices, starting as a quaestor, maybe serving as an aedile or praetor, and eventually reaching consul. In practice, you needed patronage, shameless bribery, and the kind of family name that made doors open before you even knocked. The Senate pretended to be Rome's conscience, but let's be honest, it was a cartel of aristocrats protecting their estates, their slaves, and their power. Let's imagine a character for a moment, Lucius, a freshly ambitious son of a wealthy equestrian. He's got all the makings of a senator: money, connections, a villa outside Rome filled with Greek statues stolen from some unfortunate conquered city. But what Lucius doesn't have is experience. Not that it matters. With enough coin, he'll win the election for quaestor by buying votes from the poor, hiring claqueurs to cheer him in the forum, and bribing the right priests to declare the gods are obviously in his favour. If you think modern politics is rotten, you'd feel right at home here. At least today, scandals break on social media. In Rome, they were shouted out in the streets, carved into graffiti, or sung by actors on stage. The irony is thick. Senators were supposed to be Rome's guardians of virtue. The very word senator comes from senex, meaning old man, a nod to wisdom. But instead of venerable wisdom, most were more concerned with padding their purses. Sure, a few Stoics like Cato the Younger stood in the Senate refusing to bend to corruption. But guess how their stories ended? That's right, suicide, defeat, and exile. Idealism had no place in a chamber where the price of loyalty was often paid in gold, wine, or promises of political favours. Here's the darker truth. Senators weren't just politicians, they were land barons. Roman law demanded a senator could not directly engage in business-like trade because it was considered unbecoming. How noble, right? Except that didn't stop them from creating a class of middlemen, the publicani, who did the dirty work of tax farming, shipping, and profiteering, while the senators reaped the rewards. So while they pontificated about Rome's destiny, their estates were worked by hundreds of slaves imported from Gaul, Carthage, and Greece. Imagine standing in the curia, wagging your finger about the dignity of Rome, then returning home to whip a Greek tutor for not teaching your son enough Homer. Hypocrisy practically dripped from their marble sandals. And it wasn't all speeches and scrolls. Senators had to perform an endless balancing act. The emperor's favour on one side, the mob's approval on the other, and the knives of rivals behind their backs. A single misstep could end not just your career, but your bloodline. One false vote, one ill-timed speech, and suddenly your villa was being confiscated, your son sent into exile, and your name chiselled out of public monuments. Romans had a delightful practice called damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, where they literally erased you from history as if you never existed. It's a level of cancel culture Twitter could only dream of. Criticism? Oh, plenty. The Senate itself was mocked in its own time. Cicero, the great orator, couldn't stop insulting his fellow senators for their incompetence. Sallust wrote about their greed and moral decay. Even the emperors used them as props. Augustus humoured them, Caligula humiliated them, and Domitian terrorized them. The senators liked to think of themselves as Rome's backbone. But really, they were Rome's most gilded liability, too rich to ignore, too cowardly to act, and too addicted to luxury to live up to their own propaganda. But here's the hook for tonight. Despite all this corruption, the Senate endured. For centuries, through wars, assassinations, fires, and emperors who treated them like chess pieces, senators kept showing up in their white togas, pretending they mattered. Why? Because in Rome, power wasn't just survival, it was legacy. A senator might lose his fortune, his land, or even his head, but if his name carved into a triumphal arch survived, then in a twisted way, he still won. And that's where we'll leave segment 1, at the gates of ambition, staring at the truth that becoming a senator wasn't about wisdom or service, but about clawing your way into an elite circle where the rewards were immense and the risks were fatal. Tomorrow, when we step into segment 2, we'll follow Lucius through his first mornings as a senator, when he had to rise early, open his doors, and face the mob of clients waiting to demand favours in exchange for loyalty. If you think that sounds exhausting, you're right. Senators didn't just rule Rome, they also had to play host, patron, and ATM machine every single day. If you ever imagined a Roman senator rolling out of bed at noon, stretching in a silk robe, and strolling lazily into the forum to give some grand speech, you've been lied to by Hollywood. Real senators woke up painfully early. In fact, their day started before the sun had fully risen, because by dawn they were expected to open their grand villa doors for the ritual known as the salutatio. This was less of a greeting and more of a parade of desperation. Picture it, Lucius, our newly minted senator, barely awake, maybe nursing a hangover from too much Falernian wine the night before, is already standing in his atrium while a mob of clients shuffle in, each one eager to beg for favours, money, or a connection that might save their miserable little lives. The salutatio was supposed to show the senator's status. The more clients you had, the greater your prestige. But here's the reality. Half the men who showed up weren't genuine supporters. They were human props. Professional clients actually existed. Men who made a career out of flattering senators in exchange for a daily handout of bread, a little cash, or maybe a promise of legal protection. It was political theatre, and every senator was both the actor and the audience. Imagine running a daily talent show where everyone came to clap for you, and you paid them for the privilege. If that doesn't sound exhausting, remember it happened every single morning, without fail, like a grim version of checking your notifications. Except instead of likes, you got sweaty men in shabby tunics pleading for favours. Lucius had to put on a performance. He couldn't simply hand out coins and dismiss the crowd. No, he had to look generous, powerful, and merciful. A senator's reputation depended on the illusion that he personally cared for every client, even though in reality he couldn't remember most of their names. Some clients followed him through the streets, creating a train of hangers-on as he moved toward the forum. The bigger the train, the more important you appeared. It didn't matter if you were corrupt, incompetent, or secretly hated by half the Senate. If you walked in with a herd of clients behind you, you looked like a man of Rome. And here's the dark truth. Those clients weren't just flattering parasites. They were pawns in the brutal game of politics. They voted when you needed votes. They shouted in your support during public assemblies, and if push came to shove, they could be organised into mobs. Roman politics wasn't just decided in the Senate chamber. It was decided in the streets, by who could rally the loudest, angriest crowd. Senators who failed to keep their clients happy risked losing more than prestige. A rival could swoop in, bribe your client army away, and suddenly you weren't the powerful patron anymore. You were yesterday's news, ignored, ridiculed, or worse, left without protection when knives flashed in a dark alley. Critics of Rome loved pointing out this hypocrisy. The Senate liked to imagine itself as a council of wise elders, but in reality, It was an elaborate pyramid scheme where loyalty was rented, not earned. Cicero himself, despite his lofty speeches, had to play this game, doling out favours and cash like any other senator. He complained bitterly about it in his letters, mocking the crowds of beggars who filled his mornings. And yet he still did it, because to skip the ritual meant political suicide. You might as well walk into the Curia with a sign that read, "I am irrelevant." The daily grind wasn't just humiliating, it was dangerous. Remember, Rome was a city of over 1 million people, a filthy, chaotic metropolis where poverty, disease, and violence boiled under the marble surface. Senators were seen as walking treasure chests. Lucius couldn't stroll out with his entourage without worrying about being mobbed, harassed, or targeted by political enemies. To survive, he relied on bodyguards and slaves, men whose entire purpose was to keep the crowd in line. Even so, plenty of senators were attacked in broad daylight. Popularity wasn't measured in love, it was measured in fear, and the mob could turn from cheering to jeering in an instant. And let's not pretend this was a noble charity system. Clients weren't given handouts out of compassion. It was transactional. A senator's bread and coins came with invisible strings attached. Support me, vote for me, shout for me, and maybe I'll keep you alive another year. Rome's poor were trapped in this cycle, dependent on the rich for survival, while the rich depended on the poor to inflate their egos and power. It's a relationship that feels uncomfortably familiar even today. One side pretending generosity, the other pretending gratitude, both knowing the whole thing is rotten to the core. Of course, there were senators who hated every moment of this. The Stoics in particular loathed the morning ritual, seeing it as beneath dignity. They wanted to believe virtue was its own reward, that wisdom should matter more than popularity. And Rome rewarded them for this moral stance by either ignoring them, ridiculing them, or driving them to suicide. Take Seneca, advisor to Nero. He wrote endlessly about the emptiness of wealth and the importance of simplicity, while quietly amassing a fortune so huge he could have funded an entire legion. When the hypocrisy finally caught up with him, Nero forced him to slit his wrists in a warm bath. So much for virtue. Meanwhile, senators who leaned fully into the system thrived. They spent their mornings smiling, shaking hands, handing out coins, and pretending they cared about the common man, all while plotting in the shadows to steal more provinces, secure more slaves, and pass laws that benefited themselves. If that sounds cynical, it's because Rome perfected cynicism centuries before we ever coined the word. By mid-morning, Lucius would have finished the ritual, handed out the daily bribes, and gathered his parade of clients. Then came the next act, the slow, deliberate march to the Forum, where business truly began. Picture a marble square filled with shouting, gossip, backroom deals, and the occasional fistfight. Senators strutted in their spotless togas, each one bleached so bright it practically glowed, while their slaves carried tablets, scrolls, and bags of coin. The Forum was the theatre, and senators were both actors and scriptwriters. But no matter how polished the performance looked, it all began with that humiliating morning ritual, clients at your door, hands outstretched, voices whining for attention. Step through the heavy doors of the Curia Julia, the Senate House, and you might at first be impressed. Marble floors polished smooth by centuries of sandals, walls rising with cold grandeur, a space echoing with the weight of Rome's so-called wisdom. But don't be fooled. Beneath the architecture and ceremony, this was less a temple of reason and more a marketplace of egos. Our Senator Lucius, after enduring his morning circus of clients, now enters this chamber where reputations could be made, destroyed, or erased entirely before lunch. The seats weren't randomly chosen either. They were arranged by rank, seniority, and status, a not-so-subtle reminder that even in politics Rome loved its hierarchies. The older, more established senators claimed the best spots, while newcomers like Lucius sat closer to the margins, expected to watch and learn. preferably without saying something so foolish it got them laughed out of the room. Debates were supposed to be noble, about laws, wars, or the fate of provinces. In practice, they often descended into shouting matches, backstabbing, or long-winded speeches designed not to solve problems, but to impress whichever powerful figure was lurking behind the scenes. Senators prided themselves on oratory, but the audience wasn't the people. It was each other, the emperor, and history itself. Every word spoken here might be scribbled down by some scribe, polished, and eventually passed off as literature. Cicero's speeches that schoolchildren read for centuries. Many were delivered in this very hall, though with considerably more insults than modern textbooks admit. He once called his rivals drunkards, thieves, and traitors, all in the same breath. And the chamber roared, not because justice was served, but because the performance was entertaining. Let's not romanticize this too much. Senators weren't philosophers selflessly searching for truth. They were landowners protecting their estates, generals arguing for more legions, and aristocrats scheming for their children's futures. Behind every eloquent phrase was usually a fat purse of bribes. Votes were bought, opinions rented, loyalties auctioned. If Lucius wanted to pass a law, he didn't just need a convincing argument. He needed money, favors, and friends willing to shout at the right moment. Rome prided itself on mos maiorum, the traditions of the ancestors, but tradition was a convenient mask for corruption. Dark facts linger everywhere in this chamber. Think of the year 133 BCE, when Tiberius Gracchus, a senator turned reformer, dared to challenge the landowning elite. He proposed redistributing land to the poor, a move that horrified his fellow senators, not because it was unjust, but because it threatened their estates. The response? They beat him to death right there, inside or just outside the curia, using clubs, stools, and anything they could grab. That's Roman politics in action. 1 minute you're proposing reform, the next you're bludgeoned into history. The Senate never forgot that lesson, and neither did future would-be reformers. Lucius, if he had any sense, would tread carefully. Senators who spoke too boldly often paid with their lives. Even under the emperors, when the Senate's power was mostly ceremonial, the dangers remained. Caligula once declared he would make his horse a senator, a gesture of pure mockery toward the chamber. Domitian filled the curia with spies, forcing senators to clap like trained seals or risk execution. Nero staged debates only to laugh at the participants, enjoying the spectacle of aristocrats squirming. It was political theatre, yes, but with daggers waiting in the wings. Of course, not everything was so grim. Senators still clung to rituals, believing them to be shields of dignity. They wore the toga with its broad purple stripe, a costume that shouted status, but was about as comfortable as wrapping yourself in a bedsheet on a hot Mediterranean afternoon. They listened to speeches that droned on for hours, nodding sagely, while quietly calculating whether they'd have time to sneak to their villas before dark. And through it all, slaves bustled behind the scenes, carrying scrolls, bringing water, and recording notes. The men who supposedly ruled the world couldn't even keep track of their own paperwork without help. Sarcasm practically writes itself here. This was the body that claimed to embody Roman virtue. Yet half of them were scheming for governorships where they could loot provinces blind. A posting in Asia Minor or Hispania wasn't just an honour, it was a golden ticket. Governors returned to Rome dripping with wealth stolen from local populations, slaves packed into ships, and enough silver to fund decades of banquets. When accused of corruption, senators shrugged. Everyone was guilty. It was almost part of the job description. If caught, you might suffer a slap on the wrist, but more often you simply bribed your way out of trouble. Rome's Senate wasn't so much a council of state as it was the world's most exclusive investment club, trading lives and provinces like chips on a gaming board. Criticism was constant even in antiquity. The historian Sallust, himself a senator, described the chamber as filled with greed, hypocrisy, and moral decay. Juvenal, the satirist, sneered at their gluttony, mocking senators who debated philosophy in public, but secretly drowned themselves in oysters and wine at home. The Senate, he suggested, wasn't just decadent, it was laughably hypocritical. And yet, despite all this, the institution endured, adapting itself to every regime, every emperor, every purge. Lucius might roll his eyes at the farce, but he knew better than to laugh too loudly. The truth is, senators loved to pretend they mattered. Even when the emperor held all real power, the Senate still clung to its traditions, its rituals, and its speeches. They liked to imagine they were Rome's guiding hand, even if they were really just the emperor's expensive backdrop. The irony is delicious. A body that once controlled armies, dictated wars, and ruled provinces was reduced to applauding emperors, rubber-stamping decrees, and occasionally being slaughtered for sport. And yet, each senator still believed himself a guardian of Rome's greatness, as if repeating the lie often enough might make it true. And so, as our Lucius sits in the Curia, watching older senators bicker, flatter, and posture, he learns the real game. Speak carefully, spend lavishly, flatter shamelessly, and above all, survive. The marble walls echo with noble words, but under the surface, it's a blood sport played with coin, poison, and whispered betrayal. Outside the marble walls of the Curia, the real seat of a Roman senator's power stretched for miles. Literally. It wasn't found in speeches or scrolls, but in acres of olive groves, vineyards, quarries, mines, and rows of sweating, half-fed slaves chained together beneath the Mediterranean sun. Rome's elite didn't rule because they were wise, they ruled because they owned everything. Land was the root of status, and senators were expected to accumulate it like dragons hoard gold. If you didn't have sprawling estates, you weren't really a senator. You were just a man playing dress-up in a borrowed toga. Lucius, after 1 year of showing up in the Senate and mastering the art of nodding without committing, finally acquired his first real estate, a modest estate outside Capua, with olive trees that hadn't been watered in months, and a slave workforce that was mostly made up of chained Gauls too exhausted to rebel. It was hardly impressive, but it was a start. He knew that the true path to senatorial permanence didn't run through the forum. It ran through land, through villas where he could host fellow senators, feed them exotic birds, and discuss the latest grain shortage while sipping honeyed wine imported from Hispania. In Rome, status was measured in distance. The further your land extended from the city, the louder your name echoed in the marble halls. But let's talk about the dark heart of it all. These estates didn't run on Roman ingenuity or discipline, they ran on slavery. Massive, brutal, unrelenting slavery. Senators owned hundreds, sometimes thousands of enslaved men, women, and children. They worked the fields, cleaned the vomitoriums, managed household accounts, taught Latin to spoiled sons, and massaged their masters with oils they'd never afford in 10 lifetimes. Slaves were not only property, they were infrastructure. There were so many that entire logistics systems had to be built around managing them. In some elite households, there were slaves whose only job was to oversee other slaves. Slaves kept Rome running, but they also made sure senators had time to debate ethics after a 10-course lunch. Senators, ever the masters of optics, justified this massive machine with a shrug. These people were conquered, they said. They had lost, and therefore they served. It was the natural order, ordained by the gods. Never mind that many were captured through manufactured wars of convenience or sold by corrupt governors desperate to curry favour back home. Lucius, like his peers, told himself he was treating his slaves kindly. He allowed them 1 holiday a year, let them keep a few coins if they behaved, maybe even promised manumission after a decade or two of perfect service. But deep down, he knew. They were assets, useful, disposable, and easily replaced. And when we say assets, we mean it literally. Slaves were listed in estate inventories like furniture. A good farm slave might cost 1,500 sesterces, a beautiful Greek tutor maybe 6,000. Female slaves fetched high prices for entirely predictable and depressing reasons. If one died of exhaustion, no problem, another shipload from Britannia or Syria would arrive by spring. Roman senators loved to moralize in speeches, but at home they beat servants for overcooking lentils and kept mute slaves to avoid gossip leaking to the neighbours. If you ever imagined Roman estates as peaceful sanctuaries of order and elegance, you might be disappointed to learn they were also powder kegs. Slave revolts weren't rare. They were terrifyingly common. The most infamous, led by Spartacus, began on an estate not so different from Lucius's. Thousands of slaves fled into the countryside, burning villas and slaughtering owners. The Senate panicked. At one point, the rebels nearly reached Rome itself. After years of brutal fighting, the revolt was crushed, and the survivors, over 6,000 of them, were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies hanging as a warning to every senator who ever dared treat his workforce like cattle. Which is to say, all of them. Even after that horror, nothing changed. The system was too profitable to dismantle. Senators returned to business as usual, replacing slaves, rebuilding villas, and increasing productivity through more cruelty masked as efficiency. They wrote letters about virtue and discipline, all while their overseers whipped 10-year-olds for picking grapes too slowly. And while Rome's moralists wrung their hands about decadence, they quietly dined on the results. After all, ethics rarely survive a profitable harvest. But estates weren't just economic engines, they were political ones. A senator with vast holdings could supply grain to the city during shortages, winning favour with both the mob and the emperor. He could host elaborate festivals on his grounds, complete with exotic animals and theatrical displays that would make a Hollywood director blush. Lucius, in time, began to understand this. His Capuan farm wouldn't make him rich, but it would serve as a stage for power. Every olive pressed, every amphora shipped, every guest entertained. It all spoke volumes louder than any Senate speech ever could. Of course, running an estate came with its own labyrinth of corruption. Tax evasion was a sport. Senators would falsify crop yields to reduce levies, bribe provincial governors to ignore illegal land grabs, and use slave labour to undercut smaller farmers until they were forced to sell. Usually to, you guessed it, another senator. It wasn't enough to succeed. Others had to fail. Rural Italy became a checkerboard of senatorial domains, stitched together by greed and enforced by private guards masquerading as farmhands. And yet, in public, these same men claimed to be the moral compass of Rome. They passed laws regulating luxury, warning against too much silk or perfume, while their wives dined on peacock tongues and wore diamonds stolen from Parthian queens. They condemned excess while swimming in it. It was a performance so grand it makes modern hypocrisy look like amateur hour. Even the poets noticed. Horace, who dined with senators often, wrote with a mixture of admiration and thinly veiled criticism. He joked about the absurd wealth, the endless banquets, the way senators chased moderation while stuffing themselves with fish from Spain and melons out of season. But even Horace, clever as he was, never bit too hard. He knew where his patrons came from, and more importantly, who paid his rent. As the sun set on another day, Lucius walked the edge of his estate, imagining expansion, improvements, and more elegant cruelty. He considered building a new villa, installing fountains, maybe importing a sculptor from Athens. He'd need more labour, of course, more land, more control. That was the rhythm of senatorial ambition, never content, always expanding. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was certainly maintained through centuries of oppression, greed, and a carefully scripted illusion of virtue. Chapter 3. Politics as Theatre. Rome's senators loved to tell themselves they were the backbone of the Republic, even long after the Republic was dead. And perhaps no stage better captured their delusion than the Roman Forum. If the Curia was where laws were passed, the Forum was where masks were worn. It was not just a marketplace or a civic centre, it was the city's beating heart of public performance. And for a Roman senator, politics wasn't just duty, it was theatre. You didn't just act powerful, you had to look powerful, sound powerful, and most importantly, perform power. Lucius learned this quickly. He might have owned land, earned a title, even claimed a seat in the Senate. But in the Forum, none of that mattered if he couldn't play the part. Here, surrounded by colonnades, statues, temples, and gawking crowds, a senator had to present himself like an actor stepping onto a stage. His toga had to be spotless, his gestures controlled, his tone modulated, and his face set in a mask of gravitas. A smirk, a stumble, or a sweat stain could undo months of behind-the-scenes deals. Because in Rome, perception was reality, and reality was whatever you convinced the crowd to believe. The Forum was always loud. Shouts from vendors, chatter from slaves, speeches from magistrates, and the constant clatter of sandals on stone made it impossible to think, which perhaps was the point. In this chaos, senators delivered their public addresses, not to persuade the people. No, that would have been too honest, but to be seen doing the right kind of persuading. The orator's platform, the rostra, was the prized position. Lucius had to wait years to even approach it. And when he finally did, he learned quickly, this wasn't about logic or truth. This was about volume, rhythm, and theatrical pauses. If your voice cracked, the crowd laughed. If your rhetoric soared, the crowd cheered, unless someone paid them not to. Because, yes, applause in Rome could be rented. There were entire troops of professional clappers and booers hired by rival senators to sway the atmosphere. A speech didn't need to be good, it just needed to sound victorious. And this was before microphones, mind you. A sore throat could lose you a political alliance. A well-placed cheer at the right moment could gain you one. And, as always, Rome found a way to codify even the chaos. There were traditional hand gestures for emphasis. An open palm meant honesty. A pointed finger meant accusation. A raised arm meant appeal to the gods. Every senator learned them like a child learns table manners. But unlike manners, these gestures weren't about respect, they were about survival. Use the wrong one, and you look like a fool. Use them too well, and you might be accused of ambition, which in Roman political culture was practically a capital crime. And yet, ambition was the only reason anyone stood there. No senator rose to speak in the Forum purely out of civic duty. They rose to gain visibility, favour, and power. Many timed their speeches, not for the benefit of the people, but for the ears of a particular general, a political patron, or, later in the imperial period, the emperor himself. The irony was suffocating. These were the men supposedly leading Rome, but every sentence they uttered was a carefully staged audition for someone else's favour. The content of the speeches, often formulaic. Fathers of the Senate, people of Rome, followed by appeals to tradition, exaggerated threats to the Republic, and sanctimonious references to ancestors who would surely weep if they saw the moral decay of the current generation. Spoken, of course, by men who hosted orgies in villas paid for by slave labour. The hypocrisy was so deep it might as well have been structural. The most decadent senators gave the loudest speeches about moderation. The most corrupt railed the hardest against bribery. And the crowd, half-starved and half-bored, cheered anyway. Of course, the real power plays didn't happen on the rostra. They happened in shadows, behind columns, in whispered exchanges over wine, in quiet threats delivered by freedmen who pretended to be servants. Deals were made in the baths, not in the open. But to reach that point, to earn the right to whisper in ears that mattered, a senator first had to prove he could perform. Because in Rome, politics was a drama, and every senator was just one poor performance away from being cut from the cast. Lucius, still new to the art, fumbled more than once. Once, in an effort to condemn a rival's corruption, he accidentally misquoted a line from Virgil, which drew snickers from the crowd and polite apologies from his speechwriter slave. He learned to time his rhetoric to the ambient noise, to gesture just as a sunbeam fell across his toga, to modulate his voice when he saw the priest of Jupiter walk by. He didn't believe most of what he said, but that didn't matter. The forum wasn't for truth, it was for resonance. And if that sounds performative, well, it was. Senators often hired image consultants. Not in name, of course, but in function. Slaves and freedmen advised on everything from dress to phrasing. There were experts in the art of captatio benevolentiae, the act of capturing goodwill from the crowd. Senators rehearsed speeches in private courtyards like actors practicing for a tragedy, knowing full well that the audience outside would decide their fate not on logic but on spectacle. Even worse was the necessity of the mob. You didn't just speak to the people, you depended on them. The urban poor were a volatile and essential audience. Displease them, and they might riot. Please them too much, and you risked seeming populist, which scared the Senate. Managing this balance was like juggling snakes. One wrong move and you were bitten. Politicians lived in fear of the crowd's mood. It was said that Julius Caesar's greatest weapon wasn't his army, but his ability to charm the mob. When he died, they burned the Senate House down. That's the power of theatre when your actors forget who's watching. There was a dark comedy to all of it. Senators who claimed to uphold Roman dignity spent half their day preening in public and the other half begging for applause. They denounced spectacle while turning every vote into a parade. They feared emperors, envied generals, and resented each other. And still, they stood on the rostra, shouting into chaos, hoping someone important would notice. And perhaps the bitterest irony is this: they believed it all mattered. They genuinely thought they were guiding Rome, when in reality they were performing lines written centuries before. The Republic was long dead, the Empire in full swing, and yet they clung to the illusion of influence like old actors who refused to leave the stage after the curtain's fallen. Lucius knew it, deep down. Everyone did. But like everyone else, he kept acting, because quitting the performance meant vanishing from history. And in Rome, obscurity was worse than death. For a Roman senator, family was not merely personal, it was political infrastructure. Bloodlines were brand names, marriage was statecraft, and children were walking insurance policies against obscurity. The modern idea of falling in love would have gotten you laughed out of the atrium. In Rome, love was optional. Dynastic strategy was mandatory. And if you happened to love the person you married, well, that was a happy accident, and frankly, none of the Senate's business. Lucius, like every ambitious senator before him, didn't get to choose his wife. She was chosen for him by a committee of mothers, uncles, and family accountants, with the primary qualifications being her father's status, her mother's dowry, and her family's voting influence. Her face was optional. A high-born Roman girl might be betrothed at 12, married by 14, and buried by 30, assuming childbirth didn't get her first. And senators didn't just marry to unite families, they married to conquer territories of influence. A single wedding could realign half the political alliances in Rome. Divorce, by the way, was easy and frequent. If your wife's family fell from favour or someone better came along, you could send her packing with a note. Legally, you didn't even need a reason. The official phrase was, "I no longer wish to be married." That's it. Marriages lasted as long as they were convenient. Emotional damage was not a legal concern. Children were less people than they were future chess pieces. Sons were raised to extend the family's political reach, daughters to be traded in the next round of strategic marriages. Even in childhood, the pressure was suffocating. A senator's son didn't grow up with toys, he grew up with expectations. By the age of 7, he was being tutored in Greek, Latin, and oratory. By 12, he was shadowing his father at the forum. By 16, he was wearing a toga virilis and expected to act like a miniature senator himself. Childhood was less a phase and more of a waiting room for duty. You were raised not to be yourself, but to become a vessel for the family's ambitions. The domestic sphere, if you could call it that, was ruled by the paterfamilias, the oldest living male in the household. He held near total authority over everyone beneath his roof. He could arrange or cancel marriages, accept or reject newborns, disown sons, punish wives, and even legally execute his own children without trial. This wasn't symbolic power. It was written into Roman law. Some historians argue that this ultimate authority was rarely exercised. Others, less optimistic, have pointed to chilling funerary inscriptions that suggest more than one son found himself on the wrong end of his father's discipline. And while the paterfamilias might be revered in moral literature as the foundation of Roman virtue, in practice he was often just another narcissistic landowner surrounded by people too terrified to challenge him. Women, though officially excluded from politics, were far from powerless. The Roman matron wielded her influence through careful social positioning, quiet conversations behind curtained rooms, and the ability to make or break a husband's career with a single dinner party. A well-connected wife could secure alliances, arrange introductions, and even steer senatorial votes, provided she knew how to operate invisibly. Public visibility was dangerous. A woman who appeared too ambitious could be accused of immodestia, or worse, of witchcraft. That didn't stop many from pulling strings. In fact, some of the most influential players in Roman history, like Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, never spoke from the rostra, yet shaped the empire more than half the men who did. And when it came to appearances, everything mattered. Your home had to reflect your lineage. Your wife had to uphold the image of Roman modesty, even if she was privately more ambitious than her husband. Your children had to perform like actors in the tragedy of legacy. Even your ancestors had to behave. Senators often faked or exaggerated their family histories, commissioning busts of fictional relatives and inventing heroic military exploits in the Punic Wars that no one dared fact-check. Family was a narrative as much as a reality, and the better you could spin it, the longer you stayed in power. But behind the carefully polished columns of senatorial households was often something closer to a slow-moving domestic crisis. Infidelity was rampant on both sides. Husbands kept mistresses, concubines, and slaves for pleasure. Wives, especially those married off as teenagers to aging husbands, often found their own discreet arrangements. Affairs were tolerated, provided they remained quiet. Scandal was not in the act itself, but in the publicity. A senator could sleep with half his household staff without consequence, but a wife who smiled too long at a poet might find herself exiled to the coast by morning. Children, meanwhile, were not guaranteed safety. High infant mortality rates meant many Roman families lost more children than they raised. A senator might father 10, only to see 3 survive past adolescence. Those that did survive often bore the psychological scars of relentless pressure and conditional affection. A failed son wasn't just a disappointment, he was a threat to the family's survival. Suicides, disinheritance, and mysterious illnesses conveniently timed with inheritance shifts weren't unheard of. And if you were adopted, that wasn't necessarily better. Roman adoption wasn't about love, it was about legacy. A senator with no male heir might adopt a promising young noble to carry on the family name, often renaming him entirely and rewriting his identity overnight. Julius Caesar adopted his great-nephew Octavian for this reason, not because he loved him more than anyone else, but because he needed a political heir. It worked. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But not all adopted sons were so fortunate. Many were political placeholders, discarded when better options came along. Even death was a performance. Funerals were grand affairs, meant to display status and assert lineage. Actors might be hired to wear masks of dead ancestors, parading around as proof of the family's ancient glory. Eulogies were less about the deceased and more about reminding Rome who was still alive and still powerful. A senator's tomb wasn't just a resting place, it was a campaign poster written in marble. Lucius, as always, learned to play the game. He married well, not happily, and fathered sons who bore the weight of legacy like soldiers carrying armour 2 sizes too big. His wife hosted dignitaries, kept gossip at bay, and quietly ensured her daughters married men with just enough influence to protect them, but not so much power that they'd get caught in the next purge. Behind closed doors they rarely spoke. In public they embodied Roman virtue. In private they counted coins, calculated inheritances, and prepared for the day when one of them might need to disappear before dawn. Chapter 4. Luxury and Daily Life. To hear them speak of it, the Roman senators were paragons of virtue, stoic men sculpted from discipline and tradition, defenders of the old ways who ate modestly, slept on hard mattresses, and frowned upon excess. But to see them live was another matter entirely. Strip away the moralizing speeches, and you'd find a class of men so thoroughly soaked in luxury that it would make a Renaissance pope blush. If Roman senators preached simplicity, it was only because they had enough wealth to afford it as a hobby. Let's begin with the villas. A senator's domus in Rome was only one of many properties, most owned country estates. Lavish palaces tucked into the hills of Tuscany, the Bay of Naples, or the hills of Latium. Far enough from the city's noise, but close enough to return in time for a Senate vote or an impromptu assassination. These weren't humble retreats. They were sprawling compounds with mosaic-tiled floors, private bathhouses, imported Greek columns, and atriums designed to make visitors feel both awed and slightly embarrassed by their own poverty. The gardens alone could support a small village, maintained by armies of slaves whose only job was to water fig trees and pluck roses before they had the audacity to wilt. Daily life for a senator, once freed from his morning obligations in the city, was an exercise in indulgence masquerading as routine. He might begin with a bath, one of several taken during the day, followed by a light snack of honeyed dates and peacock eggs, which were neither cheap nor remotely necessary. By midday he'd be lounging on a carved couch in his triclinium, his dining room, dressed in a tunic made from Egyptian linen, the kind of fabric so sheer it made togas seem like woolen torture. While his slaves fanned him and recited excerpts from Homer or Virgil, he might review household accounts or dictate letters to distant governors about tax shipments, troop movements, or wine exports, all of which, in some way, funneled back to his bank account. Speaking of wine, Roman senators were connoisseurs to the point of absurdity. The finest Falernian vintages were aged until thick as syrup and served in glassware imported from Alexandria. But this wasn't about taste, it was about status. The more obscure and expensive the vintage, the better it served its real purpose, to remind everyone at the table that the man pouring it could afford to do so. And if the guests happened to be drinking cheaper blends mixed with seawater, even better. Hospitality in Rome wasn't about equality, it was about hierarchy, and you were never supposed to forget who the host was. Banquets were the centerpiece of senatorial luxury, and they were anything but moderate. A typical evening feast might begin at sunset and stretch into the early hours, filled with dancers, poets, acrobats, and sometimes gladiators brought in to duel between courses. The food was often grotesquely elaborate. Dormice stuffed with minced pork and honey, jellyfish marinated in vinegar, or flamingo tongues served on silver platters. And yes, flamingo tongues were a thing, prized for their tenderness and price tag. Guests reclined on couches, not chairs, arranged in rigid social hierarchies. The most honoured sat closest to the host. The least shuffled to the back where the wine was warmer and the entertainment louder. Of course, all of this unfolded under the guise of cultural refinement. Music was played on imported lyres, Greek slaves quoted philosophy, painted frescoes depicted myths that conveniently mirrored the host's self-image. Hercules, Jupiter, Aeneas, all heroes who, coincidentally, owned slaves, drank heavily, and never seemed to worry about budgets. For senators, decadence wasn't just allowed, it was intellectualized. They spoke of Epicurean moderation while guzzling oysters from 3 different provinces. They denounced gluttony while nibbling 10-course dinners. They praised simplicity while bathing in marble tubs large enough to drown a minor noble. But not everyone was fooled. The satirists of Rome had a field day with this hypocrisy. Juvenal, Martial, and Horace painted brutal portraits of senatorial indulgence. Senators too bloated to stand, arguing about poetry while vomiting into gold bowls, pretending their perfumed hair was the scent of virtue. It wasn't entirely exaggerated. During Nero's reign, some senators were known to host sine trimalcianus dinners, modelled after fictional buffoons whose wealth outpaced their taste. These weren't just feasts. They were declarations of power, statements that said, "I own more food than you'll ever see, and I will waste it in front of your face." And that's where the cruelty of luxury takes root. Waste wasn't incidental, it was intentional. Bread thrown away rather than shared, meat left to rot rather than given to the poor. Fountains ran with wine, not because it tasted good, but because it proved you didn't care. The Roman elite measured their dominance not by what they consumed, but by what they could afford to throw away. Meanwhile, just a few streets away, the average Roman citizen lived on grain rations and prayed the next fire wouldn't destroy his tenement. Even senators couldn't always escape the price of their own excess. The pursuit of comfort made them soft, paranoid, and politically vulnerable. More than one emperor rose to power by mocking the Senate's cowardice and indulgence. Julius Caesar dressed plainly, avoided visible luxury, and was adored. Augustus lived modestly in public, cultivated discipline, and outlived every rival. Even Caligula and Nero, for all their madness, understood the optics. They knew that the people despised bloated privilege, and they fed that hatred strategically, sometimes by literally feeding senators to lions. Lucius, like many of his peers, learned to manage appearances. In public, he walked modestly, spoke cautiously, and cited Stoic philosophy. In private, he wore silk from China, used amber-scented oils from the East, and employed a personal cook who had once served a royal court in Syria. He installed fountains in his garden shaped like nymphs, each one vomiting a different kind of wine. When guests arrived, he made sure they were suitably impressed and mildly envious. After all, envy was half the point. But he also knew the risks. The more luxury you displayed, the more attention you drew from rivals, from poets, from emperors who might suddenly decide you had too much and should be reminded where your status really came from. Roman luxury, like Roman politics, was a tightrope walk. One misstep and everything you owned could be confiscated, auctioned, or burned, all under the convenient excuse of public morality. And if you complained, you'd be labelled decadent, weak, un-Roman. The same Senate that voted you honours could vote you into exile by the end of the week. For all the wealth, silk, and self-congratulatory poetry, being a Roman senator was not a job for the faint of heart. Behind the opulence lay a very real risk of violence, betrayal, or a casual paperwork-free execution. You could rise to glory on Tuesday and be exiled by Thursday, if you were lucky. The unlucky ones found their heads decorating pikes or their names carved into history only as cautionary tales. Because in Rome, the higher you climbed, the more visible your back became to knives. Let's dispense with the idea that Roman politics was just philosophical debate and harmless corruption. It was blood sport, not metaphorically, literally. Senators weren't just legislators, they were targets. Targeted by rivals, by mobs, and most of all, by emperors who used the Senate as both a prop and a purge list. Power came not with a crown, but with a very short leash, and it was often held by a man in a toga pretending not to notice the wolves sharpening their teeth. Lucius knew this, of course. Every senator did. He'd seen enough marble busts in the Forum to know how quickly things turned. Those serene stone faces, lined up in tidy rows, weren't tributes, they were tombstones. Reminders. Warnings. One wrong vote, one ill-timed word, and you could find yourself accused of conspiracy, irreverence, or simply being in the way. The Senate had mastered the art of polite political murder. They didn't need swords, they had committees. The tools of destruction were many. The most popular? The accusatio, a vague accusation of impiety, corruption, or lèse-majesté, the crime of offending the dignity of the emperor. That last one was deliciously vague. Offend him how? A tone of voice? An unflattering poem? An accidental yawn during a speech? Yes, all of the above. Emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Domitian perfected the use of paranoia as policy. They kept files. They encouraged informants. They rewarded betrayal and punished silence. Under their rule, senators disappeared regularly. Sometimes their property vanished with them. Sometimes their entire bloodline followed. The Senate didn't protest. It voted, unanimously, and usually gratefully. And yet, it wasn't always the emperor pulling the strings. Senators also ate each other alive. Competition for prestige, land, inheritance, or a key provincial governorship turned colleagues into saboteurs. A subtle insult in the forum, a fabricated letter, a whispered rumour at a banquet, and suddenly you were being hauled in front of a tribunal, your toga stripped, your name smeared across graffiti-laced alley walls. Senators hired professional poisoners, notaries to forge documents, and sometimes, if subtlety failed, thugs to handle matters more directly. Politics, after all, had to be practical. Even those who stayed in favour were not safe. Look at Seneca, philosopher, playwright, imperial advisor. He tutored Nero, guided the empire through crisis, and wrote long-winded essays about Stoic virtue. He also amassed a fortune so large it made the Senate uncomfortable. And when Nero grew bored of lectures on moderation, he simply ordered Seneca to die. No trial, no appeal. Just a polite summons, a bath filled, and a blade offered. Seneca slit his wrists, bled into warm water, and became a cautionary tale about getting too close to power without a sword of your own. Sometimes the emperor didn't even bother with accusations. He'd simply walk into the curia and have someone stabbed mid-sentence. Caligula once declared that he wished all the Senate had a single neck so he could slice it in one blow. He said it with a laugh, but no one thought it was a joke. Because in Rome, satire was a dangerous game. You could laugh at the emperor, sure, once. The Senate responded with predictable dignity. They bowed, they voted, they survived. That was the goal. Survival. Not courage, not principle, not justice. A good senator learned how to say the right things, flatter the right gods, and duck at the right moment. The few who stood up for truth became martyrs. The rest became rich. And what of the mob? They weren't idle either. While senators feared each other and the emperor, they also feared the crowd. The Roman people had a talent for violent enthusiasm. Anger about grain shortages, rumours of corruption, or just a hot afternoon could turn a peaceful assembly into a lynch mob. Senators were dragged from litters, beaten in the streets, and sometimes torn to pieces while their bodyguards ran for the hills. Lucius once had to slip out the back of a bathhouse when a crowd accused him of raising bread prices. He hadn't, of course, but truth rarely mattered. The crowd had heard the name, and that was enough. He escaped barefoot, wrapped in a borrowed towel, hiding for 2 days in a client's cellar. The next week, he hosted a banquet for the same crowd. With enough wine and salted pork, memory proved surprisingly flexible. Some senators thought they could buy safety through loyalty. They praised the emperor in speeches, dedicated statues in his honour, and married into families with imperial blood. It worked for a while. But emperors were fickle. Claudius trusted Messalina. She had him executed. Nero trusted no one and still died surrounded by enemies. Domitian trusted statues, and even they couldn't save him. No amount of loyalty could prevent a turn in the tide. The imperial mood was as stable as a chariot race in a thunderstorm. And through it all, the Senate continued. Like actors on a cursed stage, they performed, applauded, and pretended that they were the ones holding the reins. In truth, they were the horses. Decorated, fed, occasionally celebrated, but ultimately driven by someone else. Someone more ruthless, less predictable, and far more willing to light the whole stable on fire when bored. What's astonishing is how few tried to leave. Resignation was allowed, technically. You could step down, return to private life, tend to your estate. But that too was risky. To leave the Senate was to imply disapproval. To imply disapproval was to invite scrutiny. And once you were no longer useful, you were no longer protected. Retirement wasn't freedom. It was isolation. A perfect moment for your enemies to remember old grievances and file long-forgotten accusations. Lucius, ever cautious, played the game well enough to survive. He voted with the wind, smiled at threats, and kept a mental ledger of who owed what to whom. He wrote no memoirs. He hosted no poets. He praised the emperor just enough to be safe, but not so much as to seem ambitious. And when rumours began to swirl about his neighbour's treason, Lucius quietly loaned his villa for the trial banquet. The message was clear: I'm loyal, I'm useful, I'm not next. Chapter 5: Religion and Public Duty. If you asked a Roman senator what guided his life, he might say pietas, the sacred duty owed to gods, ancestors, and state. But if you asked his steward, his cook, or the slave polishing his statue of Jupiter, the answer would be a little different: optics. Because for Rome's senatorial elite, religion wasn't so much a spiritual practice as it was a tool set, one used for status, spectacle, and carefully timed manipulation. Behind the incense, hymns, and animal guts, there was always politics. After all, what better way to justify your power than to suggest the gods approved your every move? From the very beginning, Roman senators were deeply entangled with the religious machinery of the state. Not because they were spiritual visionaries, mind you, but because the line between priesthood and politics was so thin you could slice it with a papyrus scroll. Every major religious office, the Pontifex Maximus, the Augurs, the Flamines, the Quindecimviri, was occupied not by pious monks, but by senators. These were men who could deliver a speech on tax reform one morning and sacrifice a bull to Mars that afternoon, all without changing sandals. It was seamless, cynical, but seamless. And if you're wondering whether these priests had any real spiritual training, the answer is delightfully Roman: not really. To be appointed to a priesthood, one didn't need divine visions or theological insight, just connections, name recognition, and ideally, a vacancy caused by someone's unfortunate demise. Religious roles were as much about prestige as policy. They came with perks, public visibility, access to inner political circles, and immunity from certain legal obligations. Some priests even held the power to delay or veto public decisions by declaring that the gods were angry or that the omens were wrong. One suspicious thunderclap. That grain vote you didn't like just got postponed. Lucius, of course, did his time in this system. At one point he served as an augur, tasked with interpreting the will of the gods by watching the flight patterns of birds. Pigeons flying east meant good fortune. Crows flying south might spell doom. If that sounds absurd, consider that senators routinely built or delayed entire military campaigns based on which bird flapped in which direction. Did Lucius believe in it? Privately, no. Publicly, he performed the rites with appropriate solemnity. He recited the prayers, observed the skies, and nodded gravely when the gods spoke. Everyone played along. The state needed signs, and birds were cheaper than prophets. And let's talk sacrifice, because no Roman ritual was complete without a bleeding animal and a priest, elbow deep in entrails. sheep, oxen, pigs, all offered up on marble altars while incense burned and trumpets blared. The priest, often a senator, would slice open the carcass and examine the liver, heart, or intestines, searching for signs. If the organs looked healthy, the gods were pleased. If not, the ceremony had to be repeated. One wonders how many livestock were unintentionally rejected until the desired omen appeared. Senators weren't above staging a few divine approvals when their careers depended on it. This wasn't private religion. These rituals were very public, conducted in front of crowds, fellow senators, and often with imperial eyes watching. A badly performed rite wasn't just an embarrassment, it was dangerous. The public expected their leaders to maintain pax deorum, the peace with the gods. A failed ritual, a missed word in a prayer, or a clumsy sacrifice could be seen as a bad omen, not just for the senator, but for Rome itself. Wars had been blamed on botched ceremonies, plagues on sacrilegious behaviour. Senators had to perform flawlessly or risk being blamed for disasters beyond their control. Of course, the irony here is enormous. These same senators who claimed moral authority through religion were often the worst offenders of its values. They bribed priests, faked omens, and exploited rituals for personal gain. They denounced impiety in public while hosting drunken orgies at home. They built temples not out of devotion, but to earn political capital. The Temple of Concord, sponsored by a man whose family had been embroiled in civil war. The Temple of Honor, funded by a general whose victories had left entire provinces in ruin. Piety was a brand, not a belief. And the gods themselves? They were political assets. Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, each one had their champions. Senators formed unofficial cults around their favourites, using them as mascots for their policies. A military-minded senator might invoke Mars to justify aggressive campaigns. A traditionalist might appeal to Vesta or Janus to preserve old customs. Even the imperial family got deified. Augustus was declared a god after death. Caligula decided not to wait, and simply declared himself one while still alive, complete with temples, priests, and offerings. The Senate, in an act of collective humiliation, played along. Some did so out of fear, others out of ambition. A few probably out of curiosity to see just how far the madness would go. The rituals, of course, never stopped. Rome had a calendar so bloated with festivals and religious holidays that it's a miracle anything ever got done. There were over 150 days of games, ceremonies, and processions per year. Senators were expected to attend or preside over many of them. They marched in parades, sponsored feasts, and watched chariot races in honour of this god or that goddess. The public loved it. Bread and circuses after all. And senators who failed to show up, they were noted, criticised, sometimes replaced. It all came at a cost. Funding temples, hosting games, sponsoring festivals. It drained fortunes. But not spending was worse. A senator who didn't give back to the gods was seen as stingy, unpatriotic, un-Roman. So they spent. Lavishly. Statues of themselves in temple courtyards, gold-leafed altars with their family name inscribed, priests on their payroll who conveniently endorsed their candidacies. It was philanthropy with strings, generosity with an agenda. Lucius, careful as ever, walked this tightrope like a seasoned acrobat. He donated to temples. He sponsored a small shrine to Fortuna in his home province. He made sure his name appeared on enough votive plaques to avoid accusations of impiety, but never so many as to provoke envy. When the high priest of Mars invited him to co-sponsor a festival, Lucius agreed, but also made sure the wine came from his own vineyards. Piety, after all, was a great marketing opportunity, and beneath it all, senators quietly laughed. Not in public, of course, but behind closed doors, over late-night drinks and behind drawn curtains, they admitted what everyone already suspected: the gods were useful. They sanctified power. They justified war. They legitimized inequality, and as long as they kept serving that function, the Senate would continue sacrificing sheep, burning incense, and pretending to tremble at thunder. A Roman senator feared many things: disease, exile, poison in his wine, an angry emperor's gaze. But none of these fears came close to the deepest one, being forgotten. In a world where names meant power and statues outlived sons, the ultimate nightmare wasn't death. It was obscurity. To die unremembered in Rome was to have never lived at all, and so senators invested not only in land, villas and temples, but in eternity. Legacy was not sentimental, it was calculated. Every act, every law proposed, every coin minted, every stone engraved was done with an eye toward permanence. Senators didn't just want their peers to remember them. They wanted future generations, people not yet born, to read their names carved into triumphal arches and assume they were important. Memory was the currency of immortality. But unlike gold, it had to be constantly maintained, polished and, when necessary, fabricated. For starters, there were the funeral monuments. Senators rarely accepted a quiet burial. Their tombs were architectural manifestos. Mausoleums lined the roads outside the city, each one shouting status in stone. The Via Appia became a necropolis of egos, its shoulders burdened with towering sculptures, intricate friezes, and poetic inscriptions that had often been written by the deceased themselves, just to ensure the phrasing was flattering. These weren't graves. They were press releases carved in marble. Here lies Lucius Aelius, followed by a laundry list of titles, achievements, and acts of supposed generosity. No mention of the slaves who built it. No mention of the votes bought, the rivals crushed, the gods bribed, and for those who didn't trust stone alone, there were busts. Portrait busts filled private homes, public forums, and temples, often commissioned years before death. Senators might walk into a villa and see their own face immortalized in white marble, staring back like a smug insurance policy against erasure. These busts exaggerated certain features. Brows thickened for wisdom, jaws squared for strength. Wrinkles were left unpolished as signs of gravitas. Aging wasn't hidden. It was paraded. A youthful face suggested inexperience. But deep lines? That was senatorial gold. Lucius commissioned 3 busts of himself. One for his family's atrium, one for the local temple he helped fund, and one to be kept in storage for future unveiling. That's how legacy worked. You seeded your image wherever it might outlive you, and then you hoped the marble didn't crack too soon. And what of literature? Senators longed to be quoted. If they couldn't be remembered for deeds, they aimed for words. Many hired scribes to document their speeches, even if those speeches had been received with polite yawns at the time. Some rewrote their own orations after the fact, polishing arguments, adding thunderous closing lines that had never actually been spoken. Others paid poets to write flattering verses, praising their virtue, valor, or unbending sense of justice. Terms that, when applied to the average senator, were roughly as accurate as calling a fish a philosopher. But the most desperate and dangerous legacy strategy was attaching oneself to history through proximity. Senators tried to marry into famous families, associate with great generals, or build temples to align themselves with Rome's mythical past. They'd claim descent from the gods, from Romulus, from Aeneas. One senator even attempted to trace his bloodline to Hercules, which was quite the leap considering his family came from a goat-farming village in Etruria. But Rome loved a good story more than it loved the truth, and so the lie endured, inscribed, approved, and eventually believed. Still, for all their efforts, legacy was never guaranteed. Statues could be toppled, inscriptions could be defaced, names could be erased. Literally. Rome practiced damnatio memoriae, the formal condemnation of memory. If the state decided you were an enemy, your images were destroyed, your name chiseled out of public records, your existence reduced to a blank space where history used to be. It was one of Rome's cruelest and most effective punishments, not because it inflicted pain, but because it denied eternity. To be forgotten in Rome wasn't just a misfortune, it was a sentence. Lucius understood this. He donated generously to public works, not out of compassion, but to secure naming rights. A bathhouse bore his family name. A public fountain praised his dedication to the people. Even his slaves were branded with his initials, an ominous kind of marketing. And in his will, he outlined the order of his funeral procession down to the minute, which clients should cry, which relatives should carry the bier, which poems should be recited, and, most importantly, which stories should be told. The man might be gone, but the script would live on. Of course, not everyone in Rome bought into this legacy-building farce. Satirists mocked the obsession relentlessly. Juvenal described senators who spent more on statues than on feeding the poor. Martial joked that some men built temples to themselves before dying, just in case the gods forgot their names. These critics weren't wrong. Senators often devoted more energy to appearing virtuous than actually behaving virtuously. They could justify any cruelty, any corruption, if it meant their name might outlast the body that had disgraced it. And even those who succeeded weren't safe. Time played no favourites. The city burned more than once. Invasions came. Statues toppled, stones eroded, family lines vanished. Most senators, despite their frantic efforts, are known to us only by fragments. A line in a dusty history, a broken inscription, a forgotten temple dedication buried under parking lots and pigeons. Their dreams of eternal memory now live as academic footnotes and museum labels, mispronounced by school children and misquoted by tour guides. Still, they tried. Because the illusion of legacy was more comforting than the truth of impermanence. In a city obsessed with history, no one wanted to be history's victim. Better to be remembered badly than not at all. Better to be defamed than deleted. A senator who died in disgrace might still find his name etched in stone. One who died in silence would be swept away with the city's garbage. Chapter 6. The Performances of Everyday Indulgence. The Senate chamber may have been Rome's official stage, but the real performance is unfolded in its streets, atriums, and especially its bathhouses. In Rome, daily life was no less theatrical than lawmaking. Every movement, meal, and moment of leisure was designed not just for comfort, but for display. Senators didn't simply live, they curated. They didn't eat because they were hungry. They feasted so others could see them not eating like common men. The business of being a senator wasn't just about speeches and land. It was about being watched and performing your power so convincingly that no one dared question it. Lucius understood this. By his 5th year in the Senate, his public image was as carefully engineered as a temple frieze. His tunics were dyed just dark enough to signal seriousness. His sandals strapped in a way that whispered wealth without screaming it. When he bathed, he did so not merely to clean himself, but to be seen by the right people at the right time in the right bathhouse. Senators were known to schedule their random appearances to coincide with rivals. Being seen soaking next to a general or laughing with a praetor wasn't socializing. It was networking in warm water. Bathhouses, in particular, were strange arenas of status and vulnerability. Ostensibly, they were great equalizers. Everyone, rich or poor, stripped down to nothing. But Roman society didn't let go of hierarchy just because people were naked. The senators had their own preferred hours, their own private entrances, and their own scented oils carried in by personal slaves. The finest bathhouses had multiple levels, and senators made sure to occupy the most visible pools. Some even paid artists to quietly sketch them lounging in thoughtful poses, to be carved later into stone or painted into their villas. A senator relaxation, it was branding. And while we're here, let's talk about the oil. Soap, as we know it, wasn't widely used. Instead, olive oil was slathered on the skin and scraped off with a curved blade called a strigil. Rich senators used oils infused with herbs, perfumes, even gold flakes. These oils were expensive enough to feed a family for weeks. But again, that was the point. To waste wealth in this way was a public act of superiority. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was about excess masquerading as refinement. Daily life was filled with these performances. Walking to the forum? Better to be carried in a litter by 6 matched slaves, preferably Nubian, because Rome had strong aesthetic preferences. Use your left hand to pick grapes lazily, letting your rings glint in the afternoon light. Even a senator's boredom had to look deliberate. To be too interested in anything was to appear provincial. Indifference, feigned or real, was a sign of mastery. But perhaps nowhere was this performance more exhausting than in dining. Senators did not eat, they hosted. Banquets were structured like plays, with opening acts, seafood, second acts, game and exotic birds, dramatic interludes, musicians, dwarves, poets, and final acts of dessert so sugary and bizarre they doubled as art installations. Senators might serve jellied eels shaped like sea monsters or cakes that opened to release live birds. It wasn't about food. It was about wonder, about staging a spectacle so absurd it would be retold in bathhouses for weeks. Even the layout of a dining room spoke volumes. Guests were arranged by rank, not affection. The couches closest to the host held the most powerful. Further down, flatterers and liabilities. There was always a hierarchy. Even relaxation had rules. Laughter too was measured. You laughed at your host's jokes, never your own. You praised the wine's clarity, not the flavour. And you always left just early enough to be missed. Criticism of this lifestyle was constant, even in its own time. Cato the Elder scorned luxury as weakness. Seneca wrote essays condemning gluttony, while enjoying the finest delicacies in Rome. Petronius, in his Satyricon, mocked a fictional nouveau riche named Trimalchio, whose dinner parties included gold-plated pigs and star-shaped sausages. The satire hit hard, because it was barely exaggerated. Reality was already absurd enough. Behind every layer of luxury was fear. The fear of falling behind. The fear of losing relevance. The fear of not being noticed. For senators, status wasn't a fixed possession. It was a daily performance that had to be rehearsed and perfected. Miss the wrong party, wear the wrong shade of purple, host a feast without a sufficient number of imported delicacies, and you risked losing your edge. Someone else would take your place, your clients, your prestige. You'd still be rich, yes? But Rome had a cruel way of punishing irrelevance. To be unnoticed in Rome was worse than being hated. It meant your performance had failed. And what of leisure? For the senatorial class, leisure had a schedule. You couldn't simply have a nap. You had to take your meridiatio, the midday rest after lunch, ideally in a room that smelled of pressed roses and drifted with music played by enslaved boys trained in soft melodies. Reading wasn't for pleasure, but for show. Displaying Greek scrolls, quoting philosophers, pretending to struggle through Homer's hexameters, it was all part of the act. Even idleness had to look informed. This obsession with form over function extended even into marriage and family, as we saw before. A senator might not love his wife, but he would ensure she hosted the right religious rites, appeared in public only at approved times, and wore precisely measured veils that hinted at modesty while still flashing a bit of imported silk. Children were paraded like medals, evidence of fertility, virility, and continuity. Senators didn't raise children, they commissioned them. Lucius by this point had mastered the script. He feigned exhaustion after short walks to appear burdened by the weight of state. He practiced his offhand comments until they sounded natural. He hosted dinners where he complimented guests just enough to make them feel respected, but never important. He paid philosophers to accidentally visit during feasts, just to inject gravitas into the proceedings. His life was a polished fresco meant to impress, never to be touched. And yet even Lucius knew the truth behind the performance. That beneath the oil, the garlands, the imported oysters, and the recited verses, there was a gnawing emptiness. That all of it, all, the daily choreography, was less about pleasure and more about survival. To maintain status in Rome wasn't about being good, it was about being seen. Constantly, lavishly, strategically. For all their public performances, Roman senators were never truly off stage. Even within the gilded privacy of their domus, behind layers of mosaicked halls and perfumed courtyards, their lives remained carefully choreographed. What appeared to be personal space was merely the backstage of political theatre. Every glance, whisper, and indulgence inside those walls was part of the larger act. Rome had no private citizens, only performers temporarily shielded from the crowd. Lucius's household, like any senatorial residence, was a fortress of image management. The atrium alone, the central hall where guests were received, was a museum of status. Marble busts of long-dead ancestors, some real, some conveniently invented, lined the walls in solemn judgment. Inlaid floors depicted mythological scenes carefully chosen to reflect strength, virtue, and, above all, lineage. Even the servants were part of the aesthetic. The gatekeeper was selected for his booming voice, the doorman for his height, and the cupbearer for his youth and beauty. A senator's house wasn't just where he lived, it was where his legacy rehearsed. And then there were the bedrooms. Not private sanctuaries, but rather intersections of politics, performance, and quiet corruption. Marriage among senators, as we've seen, was rarely about affection. It was a transaction, strategic, conditional, and reversible. What happened behind bedroom curtains was nobody's business, unless, of course, it became everyone's business. Rome loved a scandal, and its senators, despite their stern proclamations of dignity, produced them with industrial efficiency. Affairs were so common that poets didn't write about them as shock. They wrote about them as inevitabilities. Wives took lovers discreetly, husbands did so flamboyantly. And fidelity, much like modesty, was a virtue often expected of others. Sexual politics in elite Rome was not governed by consent so much as by power. A senator could pursue whoever he wished, so long as they were beneath him, socially, economically, and legally. Slaves, actors, and foreigners were fair game. What mattered wasn't the act itself, but the optics. An affair with another senator's wife was dangerous, not immoral. Sleeping with a male slave wasn't a scandal, unless it appeared to undermine one's dominance. Roman morality had little to do with ethics and everything to do with social order. Even within the household, status dictated behaviour. Male children were groomed to reflect the father's ambition, spoken to in philosophical terms, trained to deliver speeches at 12, and reminded daily of the weight of their family's name. Daughters were rarely addressed directly, unless it was to prepare them for marriage. Their value was discussed in terms of dowry and alliance, not personality or intellect. Servants navigated this ecosystem with the caution of diplomats. A misplaced glance, a delayed command, or a poorly timed entrance could mean demotion, punishment, or worse. In a world where almost every member of the household was enslaved, obedience wasn't a guideline, it was a survival tactic. And yet, the home also served as a marketplace of secrets. Every senator's domus was filled with people who knew too much, secretaries who copied private correspondence, tutors who overheard hushed strategy, bath attendants who saw bruises and shame, whispered plots, financial frauds, illicit pacts. They all passed through these marble corridors, which meant that trust was a liability. Senators lived among eyes and ears that could ruin them. Some tried to preempt betrayal through bribery, others through fear. A few, more ruthlessly, made sure their most intimate slaves were also their most illiterate. The meals within these homes were just as performative as the public banquets, though often with a different audience. Political allies dined alongside rivals under the same roof. Gossip was traded like currency. An offhand remark about an absent senator's health could be a planted rumour. A compliment about a governor's loyalty might signal an alliance or a threat. Even the choice of food had subtext. Serving imported delicacies suggested wealth. Offering local produce might suggest patriotism. And serving too little? That was a declaration of war. Everything was intentional, even silence. And while men schemed at the table, women ran the machine. The senator's wife, though officially voiceless in law, often held more influence than any junior magistrate. She managed the household accounts, organized the staff, planned religious observances, and maintained the intricate web of female relationships that supported or destroyed political careers. A well-placed whisper at a temple, a strategically timed invitation to a feast, a gift delivered on a holy day. These were the levers of power she pulled daily, quietly, expertly. The senator spoke in the forum, but she built the audience. And through it all, Lucius manoeuvred like a man tiptoeing through a temple rigged with traps. He spoke carefully, rewarded loyalty generously, and ensured that every servant who knew too much about his finances also owed him too much to ever speak. His wife Flavia never challenged him in public, but managed his calendar, edited his letters, and occasionally deleted names from guest lists without explanation. When a rival's son suddenly found himself uninvited to a family feast, Lucius never asked why. He knew better. The household was hers to run, his to present, theirs to weaponize. The irony of all this was that Rome preached discipline and virtue while building a domestic system designed for surveillance and subterfuge. Senators quoted Stoic philosophers in the morning and bribed kitchen slaves in the evening. They held shrines to Vesta while forging documents over dinner. They declared themselves guardians of Roman values while refusing to look their own children in the eyes unless they stood perfectly straight and spoke in hexameter. And yet, the system endured, not because it was moral, not because it was stable, but because everyone knew their part. The senators performed power, their families performed loyalty, their slaves performed silence. Even the walls seemed to know when to echo and when to absorb. The home was not a sanctuary, it was a fortress, not built to keep people out, but to keep appearances in. Chapter 7, Bread, Blood and Applause. For all their wealth, estates and marble-blooded ancestry, Roman senators lived in perpetual anxiety. Anxiety not of assassins, rivals or even emperors, but of irrelevance. And nothing reminded them of their fragility more than the roar of the public arena. No matter how many slaves bowed in their hallways, or how many busts glared from their atriums, all it took was one poorly received set of games, one boo in the wrong amphitheatre, one festival misstep, and the very people they claimed to protect might tear them apart, or worse, forget their names entirely. Because in Rome, popularity wasn't earned through policy. It was bought, fed, and thrown to the lions. Public entertainment in Rome was not mere diversion, it was political oxygen. The crowds in the amphitheatre, the cheers in the circus, the gasps in the forum. They were the senators' approval ratings, campaign machinery, and legacy, all rolled into one deafening, dusty coliseum of chaos. A smart senator didn't just show up to the games. He sponsored them. He curated them. He designed them not as gifts to the people, but as sermons about his own power, wealth, and magnanimity. The more blood and bread he could conjure, the more noble he appeared. Welcome to the paradox of Roman virtue. It was an expensive business. Gladiator schools didn't fund themselves. Exotic animals had to be imported. Tigers from Parthia, elephants from North Africa, crocodiles from the Nile, all just to be slain for the amusement of citizens who wouldn't know a senatorial debate from a sewer inspection. And yet, These were the people who held the senators' reputations in their calloused hands. The same crowd that would cheer your triumph could just as easily pelt you with rotten vegetables for a delay in grain distribution. To the senatorial mind, it was a humiliating dependency. To everyone else, it was justice. Lucius had learned this lesson early. His first public event, a modest poetry reading paired with a religious procession, was met with yawns. Someone fell asleep in the third row. A child threw a fig at the statue of Minerva. He had smiled through it all, teeth clenched, dignity bleeding. By his third attempt, he hosted a chariot race in the Circus Maximus with colour-coded factions, stunt riders from Gaul, and a post-race feast involving fire dancers and free olives. The people roared. Bread rained from the stands like confetti. The applause was thunderous. No one remembered his speech in the Senate the day before. Everyone remembered the horse that flipped its charioteer mid-lap. Legacy, Lucius realized, came not from laws, but from spectacle. And the games weren't merely distractions. They were political statements. A senator who funded them was demonstrating his wealth, his control, and most importantly, his ability to give pleasure to the mob. Rome's people didn't demand justice. They demanded a show. Justice could wait. Games couldn't. Senators scheduled executions as half-time entertainment. Prisoners were thrown into the arena with dull swords or sent naked against trained beasts. Some were criminals. Others were simply unlucky slaves or political inconvenient nuisances. What mattered wasn't guilt. What mattered was timing. And the crowd responded exactly as trained. They cheered at every throat slit, every snapped spine, every beast dragged back into its cage with entrails still dangling from its teeth. They called for encores. They booed when the death was too quick. They wanted suffering as narrative, not just outcome. Senators knew this and planned accordingly. An emperor once delayed a legal verdict just to have the condemned man executed publicly during a festival. The trial was a formality. The theatre was the verdict. Critics existed, of course. Stoic philosophers wrote pained treatises on the moral decline wrought by such entertainments. They questioned how a people so obsessed with death could claim to value life. But their words were drowned in the roar of the masses. Even the senators who secretly agreed with them knew better than to say so aloud. Disapproval was unpopular, and in Rome, unpopularity was terminal. But the costs weren't only moral. Hosting games meant draining your fortune. Some senators bankrupted themselves funding spectacles they couldn't afford, hoping the glory would secure them a future post, a governorship, or simply a better marriage prospect for a daughter. It was a gamble. Sometimes it paid off. Sometimes it didn't. Senators who lost their wealth lost their status. And those who lost their status, Rome didn't have a soft landing for faded aristocrats. You were either admired or forgotten, respected or ridiculed. There was no middle path. Lucius treaded carefully. He kept a careful balance between spectacle and solvency. He never used his own beasts. He rented, he outsourced charioteers. He reused decorative torches. He praised Jupiter's will when the sun shone on his events, and blamed Neptune's mood when rain ruined the procession. He thanked the crowd profusely, ensured free grain baskets were handed out near the exit, and made sure his name was etched into every pillar around the amphitheatre. The applause was loud enough to drown out the debt, and in Rome that was good enough. The hypocrisy, as always, was staggering. These were the same senators who, in the Senate, delivered long speeches about the virtue of discipline, the dangers of decadence, and the importance of Roman values. And then, hours later, they stood in silk robes beside shrieking mobs, while men were disemboweled in the sand. The same men who passed laws against excess spent thousands on imported panthers, so that they could be slaughtered for sport. But this was Rome, where public virtue and private indulgence were not contradictions, but traditions. Even the architecture reflected this duality. The Colosseum, that grand monument of engineering and slaughter, stood within sight of the Forum, as if to remind senators daily that power did not reside in scrolls or senatus consulta. It resided in the roar of 50,000 bloodthirsty spectators. Its walls bore witness to the real politics of the empire, the kind written not in law but in sand and sinew. And yet, there was something pitiful in the whole spectacle. These were the supposed rulers of the world, reduced to party planners for a population that demanded violence over vision. The senators controlled the empire's taxes, its legions, its laws. And yet, they spent most of their political capital making sure the crowd had enough circus to forget the empty grain silos. Control wasn't a sword anymore. It was a loaf of bread flung from a balcony. And applause wasn't respect, it was appeasement. If the Roman Forum was a theatre and the Colosseum a blood-stained circus, then the real game, the dangerous, whisper-thin game, was played in silence. Behind every carved column, beyond the reach of public applause, senators schemed not with swords or speeches, but with glances, letters, and poison measured drop by drop. This was where the truly powerful operated, in the shadows, where names were erased more often than shouted, and where survival didn't come from charisma, but from discretion. Rome had no shortage of public spectacle, but its real political movements never made it to the amphitheatre. They happened over low conversations in private gardens, between bites of perfumed figs at banquets, or during seemingly innocent strolls around temple courtyards. Senators rarely stabbed each other anymore. That was too obvious, too brutish. No, ambition in Rome wore a silk cloak and a smile. Its weapons were favours granted and favours denied, debts recalled at inconvenient moments, and alliances undone by whispered rumours timed to perfection. Lucius knew this. He had watched one of his colleagues, a rising star named Quintus, climb too fast, talk too loud, and associate too openly with a military governor who was quietly amassing too much popularity. There'd been no accusation, no trial, no confrontation, just a few letters circulated anonymously, a subtle mention during a Senate session about the dangers of ambition, and a visit from a notary delivering an imperial order of reassignment to a minor province known mostly for its swamps and mosquitoes. Quintus packed his bags and never returned. He hadn't broken a law. He had broken rhythm, and rhythm was everything in Roman senatorial life. Speak too early in a debate and you looked impulsive. Speak too late and you looked irrelevant. Praise the emperor too much and you looked desperate. Praise him too little and you looked rebellious. There was a correct tone, a correct expression, even a correct speed at which to clap during public ceremonies. Applaud too enthusiastically and your peers noted the performance. Applaud too modestly, and you risked being labelled indifferent. It was a ballet, and missteps were rarely forgiven. Poison, of course, was the oldest fallback. It was Rome's unspoken equalizer. Senators employed physicians not just for health, but for chemistry. There were powders that dissolved in wine, concoctions that mimicked natural illness, and tinctures that left no trace except a faint bitterness in the mouth and a panicked, unproductive autopsy. Poison wasn't used often, just often enough to remind everyone that death didn't always come with a sword, and it rarely reached the surface. A senator who died suddenly after dining with a rival's cousin. Tragic. A coincidence. Surely the oysters were bad. Even friendship was rarely what it seemed. Senators courted alliances with the same care. A merchant chooses a scale, testing, weighing, discarding. Today's ally could be tomorrow's liability. And so they watched each other closely. Too much laughter between two senators might mean an alliance forming. Too little could mean a feud brewing. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Rome's political class had mastered the art of smiling at the man you were preparing to ruin. The scribes were in on it. Letters weren't just written. They were copied, intercepted, and circulated. A well-placed forged letter could ignite suspicion faster than a public accusation. Senators hired men specifically to imitate handwriting. Some kept copies of every letter they ever sent, just in case they needed to prove or disprove an accusation later. Archives became arsenals. The most powerful senators didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Their power came from who they could ruin with a nod. A single phrase, "He's ambitious," could be the beginning of the end. Accusations didn't need evidence. They needed momentum. A ripple, then a wave. And once it began, it was easier for everyone else to nod in agreement than to object and risk being accused of sympathy. The Senate could turn on one of its own faster than a starving mob at a grain riot. And yet, these same men who plotted so ruthlessly also toasted each other weekly. They praised each other's children, complimented their wives, exchanged gifts during festivals. It was ritual, and it was farcical, but skipping it would have been suicidal. Rome's elite wasn't bound by loyalty. It was bound by etiquette. And etiquette required the appearance of fraternity, even as everyone kept daggers under their togas. The wine might be sweet, but every sip was swallowed with caution. Lucius had grown fluent in these games. He said little in public debates, but met regularly with three key allies. They never spoke of politics directly. They discussed weather, theatre, and foreign imports, while subtly updating each other on alliances, enemies, and rising threats. When a rival senator's son made a misstep with a temple fund, Lucius made sure the error was quietly passed along to a priest with a grudge. The priest mentioned it during a harmless religious update. The rival was reprimanded. Lucius never appeared. His fingerprints were invisible. And that made them all the more dangerous. This wasn't cowardice. It was the Roman way. After all, Rome had never been built on trust. It had been built on reputation, fear, and precedent. Senators survived not by avoiding enemies, but by making sure they were never the easiest target in the room. You didn't need to be beloved, you needed to be useful, or feared, preferably both. The emperor, of course, played along. He encouraged rivalries, leaked false information, and promoted men just to watch them squirm under pressure. He understood that a Senate united could be dangerous, but a Senate consumed with its own internal warfare, that was safe, predictable, contained. So he whispered to one senator, snubbed another, and watched the consequences unfold like a chess match played by blindfolded men on a moving ship. And the result of all this, of the quiet betrayals, the veiled threats, the precision-engineered collapses, was a Senate that looked unified but was fractured to the bone. To the public, they were the guardians of Roman dignity. To each other, they were shadows pacing marble halls, waiting for the next stumble, the next scandal, the next conveniently fatal illness. And yet, none of them left. Because for all its dangers, all its venom, the Senate still offered something no other institution in Rome could, the illusion of control. To be a senator was to be visible, remembered, feared, even if it meant spending every waking moment checking your wine for bitterness and your guests for motives. Chapter 8. Influence, Education, and the Battle for Minds. A Roman senator's body might walk the forum, but his mind had to march through centuries of inherited opinion, memorized quotations, and carefully rehearsed wisdom. Influence in Rome didn't begin with money or soldiers. It began with rhetoric, with education, with the ability to fill a room with silence and then break it with a phrase sharp enough to be remembered and soft enough to avoid getting stabbed. Senators weren't just lawmakers. They were orators, philosophers, image makers, and, above all, performers of intellect. Lucius knew this well. His estate was vast, his client list longer than most grain inventories, but none of it would have mattered had he fumbled his first speech at 16. He had spent years training under Greek tutors in cramped study rooms filled with the smell of ink, oil, and fear. The art of persuasion, ars oratoria, wasn't taught. It was beaten in. A misquoted line from Homer could earn a slap. A stuttered sentence in front of a visiting senator might mean being removed from inheritance consideration. Eloquence wasn't optional. It was armor. It was currency. And in some cases, it was the last thing you clutched before exile. Roman education for the elite was designed not to enlighten, but to polish. The goal was not to think independently, but to speak beautifully. A senator's son began early, often before he could hold a stylus properly. First came the grammarian, then the rhetorician, and finally the stage. Mock trials, fictional speeches, practice debates. They didn't teach you how to lead an army or manage a crisis. They taught you how to sound good while avoiding responsibility for both. Because in Rome, language was everything. Even a bad decision could be forgiven if explained with enough flourishes, metaphors, and borrowed lines from Cicero. And while we're on the topic of Cicero, he loomed over every Roman classroom like a stern, ghostly headmaster. Senators quoted him compulsively, even those who secretly thought him overrated. His letters, essays, and courtroom battles were studied, dissected, copied, and plagiarized with religious fervor. To be compared to Cicero in a Senate session was an honor. To be accused of trying to sound like Cicero was political death. It was a strange game of homage and denial. You had to quote the past while pretending to originate it. But behind the walls of these intellectual fortresses, influence worked very differently. It wasn't about who could quote Aristotle. It was about who you quoted in public and who you dined with in private. Senators formed reading circles not to expand their minds, but to vet one another. If a man misinterpreted a passage from Livy too freely, it wasn't just an academic blunder. It revealed his instincts, his judgment, perhaps his loyalty. The same passage that praised Roman discipline might be used by one senator to justify a new law, and by another to quietly condemn the emperor. Words were weapons, and the sharpest ones often left no blood. Even libraries weren't neutral ground. The grand private collections of senators like Lucius served less as places to read and more as backdrops for influence. A man might invite a guest into his library to discuss grain tariffs, but the real message was visual. Shelves lined with scrolls from Alexandria, texts by dead philosophers bound in purple stamped leather, and copies of forbidden treatises kept purely for study. The message was clear: I am learned, connected, and powerful. Also, I know what you've read and what you haven't. The real intellectual battleground, however, was the salon. The semi-private gatherings where the elite debated philosophy, literature, and current affairs under the pretense of friendship. But everyone knew the rules. Challenge too aggressively and you risked offence. Agree too eagerly and you looked like a sycophant. The key was to offer just enough insight to appear formidable, while subtly planting the seeds of doubt or admiration in the right minds. A misplaced reference could cost you a crucial ally. A well-timed quote from Plato could win you a seat on a new committee. These salons were also gendered arenas of power. Though women could not speak in the Senate, they dominated the cultural salons of the elite. A senator's wife might host weekly readings, her guest list carefully curated to include philosophers, artists, and rising officials. These weren't idle entertainments, they were influence farms. A compliment from the hostess might elevate a guest's standing. An absence from the invite list might send a very pointed message. Some senators feared these salons more than the Senate floor. After all, here, reputations were made in whispers, not votes. And then there were the philosophers. Every senator had one, or claimed to. Stoics were the trendiest accessory of the age. Preaching self-restraint while surrounded by slaves and sipping spiced wine from imported cups, they represented everything Romans loved: seriousness with status. Senators would quote Seneca between dessert courses, nod solemnly at Epictetus, and occasionally donate to a temple just to prove their stoic detachment from wealth. Lucius, for his part, kept a stoic tutor who lived in a modest annex near the slave quarters and was summoned only when guests requested a philosophical tone to the evening. Of course, many of these men violated every principle they claimed to revere. Stoicism called for frugality. They gorged themselves on delicacies. It demanded emotional control. They publicly wept over minor slights. It insisted on truth. They lied as fluidly as they breathed. But quoting virtue in Latin was far more fashionable than living it. The hypocrisy was expected, polished, even poetic. All of this effort, this theatre of intellect, served one purpose: control. Not over oneself, but over perception. To appear learned was to appear legitimate. A senator who sounded like he knew what he was talking about was often treated as though he did, regardless of results. And if history praised him, all the better. If it didn't, his descendants could pay poets to rewrite the story. It was a game Lucius had mastered, albeit reluctantly. He published a treatise on civic duty, ghostwritten by a provincial scholar. He sponsored a lecture series on Platonic governance that no one attended but was widely admired. He hosted monthly readings in his villa's garden, inviting men who could quote Greek but also vote when it mattered. And through all of it, he smiled modestly, corrected no one, and ensured that every compliment he received echoed slightly louder than the last. In Rome, architecture was not just a backdrop to power. It was its scaffolding, its mask, and sometimes its weapon. Every column, courtyard, and atrium was a carefully placed statement of intention. You didn't simply live somewhere, you were judged by it. The senator's home was a monument to his ambition. The forum was his theatre, the basilica his proving ground, and the temples, they were his insurance policies. Not against divine wrath, gods were famously indifferent, but against public forgetfulness. To walk through the spaces inhabited by a Roman senator was to experience the strange alchemy of scale and secrecy. His domus, or private home, was both fortress and gallery. From the outside, it might appear subdued: plain stone walls, a single door, no ostentatious balcony. Roman law actually discouraged flashy facades, preferring the illusion of modesty. But step inside, and that pretense crumbled instantly. The atrium opened like a jaw wide, echoing, deliberately grand. A shallow pool in the centre reflected light upward, not for aesthetic pleasure, but to create the illusion that the family's ancestors, whose busts lined the walls, were bathed in divine favour. Subtle? Not even slightly. The rooms spiralled outward in calculated progression. First, the tablinum, where Lucius might greet his morning clients. Then, further in, the peristyle garden, an imported Greek indulgence that gave senators a place to pace theatrically while pretending to ponder matters of the state. But the real genius of Roman domestic architecture wasn't in its marble or mosaics, it was in its surveillance. The layout allowed the master to see without being seen, to listen from behind silk curtains, to appear magnanimous while quietly assessing everyone in his orbit. Senators didn't just use architecture to impress, they used it to control. Even the public spaces they haunted were designed to flatter their self-importance. The Forum Romanum, with its temples, tribunals and open-air galleries, wasn't a marketplace of ideas. It was a curated maze of hierarchy. Senators had their own entrances, their own benches, their own speaking zones. You could tell a man's influence by how far he walked before stopping. The farther into the forum he went, the more powerful he likely was, or at least wanted you to believe. It was the ancient version of a corner office, visible, elevated, and always just slightly above everyone else. But the most theatrical of all spaces was the Senate House itself, the Curia Julia. From its polished marble floor to its acoustically optimized ceiling, every inch of it whispered discipline and order. Even when its occupants were shouting over one another or plotting slow-motion coups. The building itself was a lie. It spoke of republican virtue while housing imperial puppetry. Designed to be fireproof, earthquake-resistant, and symbolically immovable, the Curia stood as a monument to the illusion that Rome's political system was still stable. Even after emperors began choosing senators instead of the people, the building remained unchanged because appearances mattered more than mechanics. Of course, not every space was public or pristine. The back corridors of power were far less elegant. Senators moved through networks of private gardens, hidden passageways, and bathhouse tunnels. A conversation that began in the forum might conclude, hours later, in the steam of a subterranean caldarium. Deals were struck under dripping ceilings, feet soaked, attendants pretending not to listen. And if they did hear something scandalous, well, they were paid to forget, or silenced to ensure it. Bathhouses, in particular, offered a unique kind of architectural theatre. While the plebs crowded into communal pools like olives in a jar, senators had access to private wings, complete with personalised oil slaves, heated massage stones, and whispering alcoves. There, a man could discuss legal reform while being scraped with a strigil, or propose a marriage alliance while being dusted with crushed saffron. It was a strange blend of grooming and governance, of sweaty bodies and slippery morals. And let's not forget the statues. Everywhere, statues. Some were mythological, others inspired by real senators posing as Mars or Jupiter, sculpted with the kind of flattering detail that only coin and ego could fund. Temples, too, were part of this landscape, not so much houses of worship as platforms for pageantry. Senators would sponsor the restoration of a crumbling temple, not because they feared divine wrath, but because a shiny new roof over Jupiter's head was an excellent way to get your name etched in stone beside it. Sacrifice was not so much about piety as it was performance. The entrails of a bull were read like stock forecasts, and if they happened to predict that Lucius should gain more influence in Hispania, well, wasn't that convenient? And beneath all this marble and plaster was another layer of architecture, hidden, essential, and never spoken of in polite company. The sewer systems, the fire brigades, the maintenance crews, usually slaves, who oiled the doors, polished the stone, and lit the torches. Rome's grandeur was built on their backs, but no senator ever gave a tour of his cisterns. That would ruin the illusion. Better to pretend the fountains filled themselves, the floors swept themselves, and the oil lamps glowed of their own civic virtue. Even funerary spaces were political real estate. A senator's tomb was not a place of mourning. It was a final performance. Oversized sarcophagi, engraved epics, idealized busts. Death in Rome was an opportunity to rewrite life. Men who had embezzled from provinces were immortalized as saviors of the Republic. Those who'd never seen battle were depicted with swords drawn. The worse your record, the more elaborate your monument. At some point, Lucius began commissioning his own epitaph, not because he was dying, but because he wanted to make sure the lies were worded beautifully. And through all of this, the architecture of Rome did its job perfectly. It distracted, it impressed, it concealed, and most importantly, it lasted. Senators rose and fell, were poisoned, exiled, forgotten. But the stones remained. They absorbed the hypocrisies, the ambitions, the polished speeches, and the unspoken crimes, and they never spoke back. So we closed this segment surrounded by walls that saw too much and said too little. In the next chapter, we will climb down from the marble platforms and walk into the real trenches of senatorial legacy, the writing of law, the wielding of patronage, and the shaping of Rome's fractured idea of justice. Chapter 9. Lawmakers and Power Brokers. How senators ruled without lifting a sword. For all the grandeur of statues and the echo of speeches, the true currency of Roman senatorial power was paperwork, decrees, endorsements, exemptions, edicts, all scribbled into parchment by candlelight and sealed with wax that smelled faintly of ambition. Senators did not govern with swords, though they often posed beside them. They governed with clauses, caveats, and cleverly misplaced commas. To be a Roman senator was to be part lawmaker, part lobbyist, and part illusionist. The real show didn't happen in the arena. It happened in the margins of policy. Let's not pretend the Senate was a bastion of democracy. By the time Lucius took his seat among the fold of wrinkled men and over-oiled hair, the Senate had long since stopped being a sovereign body. Julius Caesar saw to that. Augustus, with a velvet glove over his iron fist, replaced the Senate's teeth with gilded dentures. Still sharp-looking, but no longer capable of biting. And yet the illusion remained. Senators debated, voted, and issued opinions. Senatus consulta, which technically weren't laws, but carried the weight of imperial expectation. Translation. The emperor didn't have to follow them, but if you suggested something he liked, it might mysteriously become law tomorrow. So senators learned to write laws the way poets wrote odes, flattering, vague, and always with a verse for the emperor's ego. A good senator knew how to pass a motion that meant everything and nothing at once. One that reinforced public virtue, secured provincial stability, or protected traditional values. Phrases so empty they could hold any meaning the emperor needed that week. The real talent wasn't in the legislation. It was in the footnotes. That's where the favours were hidden. Every favour in Rome came dressed as principle. When Lucius arranged for a land tax in Gaul to be reduced, it wasn't because his cousin owned several acres there. No, it was to preserve agricultural vitality at the frontier. When he blocked funding for a naval expedition, it wasn't to undercut a rival's son in the navy. It was to reallocate resources in favour of civic development. That's what made Roman politics so enduring. It wasn't corrupt because no one knew better. It was corrupt because everyone knew how to speak corruption in flawless Latin. And patronage? That was the bloodstream of senatorial influence. Every senator had his client, clients, ranging from low-level bureaucrats and ambitious equestrians to distant provincial governors who owed him everything, including their salaries. These relationships were never casual. They were formalized through morning greetings, reciprocal gifts, and relentless expectation. A client would wake before dawn, dress in his best stolen toga, and wait outside the domus of his patron, hoping for an audience, or at the very least, a public nod. Being acknowledged by Lucius in the Forum meant you might get that trade post in Alexandria, or at least not mysteriously lose your inheritance next week. The morning ritual, called salutatio, was a grotesque parody of civic duty. Picture it, dozens of men loitering in a noble's atrium, pretending to chat about Cato's virtues while secretly jostling for visibility. And Lucius? He appeared last, leisurely, like a priest visiting his altar, blessing hopefuls with vague promises and diplomatic smiles. It wasn't humility, it was theatre, and everyone played their role, because in Rome, performance was policy, and this patronage extended beyond favours. It shaped elections. Technically, senators didn't run for office, they stood for it. Theoretically, this was to maintain dignity. In reality, it just meant that all the campaigning happened behind silk curtains and in temple courtyards. Bribery wasn't just common, it was practically a form of budgeting. Distributing gifts, sponsoring public games, commissioning free grain deliveries. These were investments. Senators didn't buy votes with coins. They bought them with bread and distraction. And once elected, they sat on various committees with names so official they sounded noble. Quaestors, aediles, praetors, each with its own maze of duties and back doors. A senator might be assigned to oversee the maintenance of aqueducts, another to inspect grain imports, another to review trials for treason. And while these tasks sounded mundane, they were loaded with opportunity. A slight delay in grain inspection? Suddenly your friend's shipment arrives first. An aqueduct deemed unstable. A reconstruction contract for your brother-in-law. Even treason trials could be massaged. What counted as betrayal was surprisingly flexible, especially if the accused couldn't afford a decent defense. And of course, the provinces. Oh, the provinces. Rome's far-flung territories were not governed, they were harvested. Senators competed ruthlessly for proconsular appointments, not because they wanted to uplift Gaul or restore order in Syria, but because governorship was a license to extract. Taxes could be manipulated, local elites could be flattered or blackmailed, trade routes could be nudged, tariffs adjusted, temples conveniently funded. A clever governor could return from a 3-year term in Spain significantly richer, albeit slightly more hated by the locals. But what did their hatred matter? They didn't vote. They barely mattered. Rome didn't need their love, it needed their silver. All of this functioned under a veneer of senatorial restraint. There were rules, technically. One wasn't supposed to extract too much. One shouldn't be seen to profit personally. But the definitions of too much and seen were helpfully vague, as long as you weren't publicly denounced, or worse, boring. Rome turned a blind eye. Scandal could be forgiven, indifference could not. And behind it all, the legal system trudged on, noble in appearance, compromised in practice. Senators wrote the laws, enforced the laws, and often ignored the laws, all while claiming to embody the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. But ask those same ancestors, those early Roman farmers and war heroes, what they thought of marble bathtubs, imported perfumes, and silk-draped courtrooms, and they might have chosen exile over legacy. Lucius, of course, played the game well. Not perfectly. He wasn't ambitious enough to climb higher, but wise enough never to fall. He endorsed the right candidates, disavowed the unpopular causes, and ensured that the young poet he'd once insulted at a dinner party never got funding from the treasury again. His laws? Mostly forgettable. But his network? Impeccable. In Rome, that mattered more. There's a strange stillness that settles over the final years of a Roman senator's life. Not silence exactly. Rome is never silent, but a different kind of noise. Less applause, more whispers, less clamour from the forum, more rustle of papyrus in the archives. The young men stop rising when you enter. The clients thin out each morning. Even your slaves stop pretending to be busy when you pass. After decades of carefully spinning the wheels of power, the senator finds himself watching them turn without him, and if he listens closely, they seem to be spinning a bit faster and less in his direction. Lucius was not a legend, not a Caesar nor a Cato. He didn't conquer Gaul or die nobly on the Senate floor. What he had was what most senators ended up with: reputation without renown, power without poetry. He retired, as many did, into quiet luxury. A villa on the Bay of Naples, a personal library full of scrolls he never quite finished, servants who remembered his habits, if not his triumphs. The sort of retirement that looked tranquil from a distance but felt like being slowly erased, one sunset at a time. And in that slow fade, the real crisis of Roman senatorial life became clear. Legacy was everything, and it was fragile. Rome's obsession with Gloria. Glory wasn't just vanity, it was insurance. If your name echoed in a historian's scroll, if your bust survived in the atrium of your descendants, if your tomb inscription boasted just the right blend of humility and self-congratulation, then maybe, just maybe, you wouldn't be forgotten. Because once you were, what had all the scheming been for? What had the laws, the speeches, the silks, the bribes, the cautious friendships, all of it really amounted to? So Lucius, like many of his peers, commissioned statues. He paid for a public fountain. He donated a portion of his wealth to the restoration of a minor temple, one that hadn't been fashionable in centuries, but whose priests were grateful and visible. He hosted literary dinners, inviting poets to declaim verses in his honour, careful to feign modesty while nudging them to compare him, favourably of course, to the dead Stoics of old. It was all a dance, and he still knew the steps. But with each passing year, the applause felt fainter. Even marble erodes. Rome, for all its glory, had a short attention span. It remembered blood and spectacle. Senators, unless assassinated spectacularly or tied to an emperor's rise or fall, faded fast. Their names might linger on plaques or in genealogies, but without story they became placeholders. And Lucius, who had once filled the forum with his white toga and careful words, now found himself watching young men give louder speeches, make bolder claims, offer newer lies. Retirement didn't mean withdrawal, not entirely. A senator could still be called upon for counsel. But counsel often meant ceremonial appearances, or being asked to nod approvingly at decisions already made. The younger generation tolerated him, the way people tolerate old wallpaper in a house they've just inherited. Familiar, a bit yellowed, and vaguely in the way. And then came the funerals, friends, rivals, even former clients. Rome was good at funerals. Eulogies were theatrical and often fictional. If a man had been petty, he became prudent. If he had been cruel, he became stern. If he had done nothing at all, he became a quiet guardian of the Republic. Lucius listened to these words with increasing skepticism. He began to wonder what they would say of him, what he would say of himself if given the floor one final time. He wrote a will, then rewrote it, then added a codicil, then removed one. The decisions were never just financial. Who he left land to, what it said about loyalty, who he snubbed, what it signalled about his final judgment. Even in death, politics clung to him like a second skin. One evening, while dictating minor edits to his secretary, adjusting a phrase about lifelong service to the state to sound less grandiose and more dignified, he paused. He realized he no longer knew if the sentence was true. Had he served Rome, or had he served himself under the guise of Rome? It was a question few dared ask aloud, because in truth, Rome never asked for service. It asked for obedience, for performance, for contribution to its myth. And senators, eager for legacy, gave it willingly, even when it demanded everything, and gave very little back. There were darker truths, too, that crept into his thoughts in these twilight years, about the laws he'd helped pass that had ruined some, protected others, about the grain shipments he'd diverted for political advantage while families starved in the provinces, about the young men he'd endorsed who turned out to be more tyrant than patriot. In youth, these choices had been victories. In age, they tasted different, and still he rose each morning. Fewer letters arrived. The household grew quieter. The oil lamps burned lower. Rome, just a few miles away, roared on without him. New games, new scandals, new senators playing the same old game with newer rules. The faces changed, but the machinery didn't. It never really did. Eventually, the end came not with fanfare, but with silence. The servant found him seated near the garden, eyes closed, hand resting on a half-read scroll of Cicero. The expression on his face was peaceful, or perhaps simply tired. Word spread quickly, and his funeral was respectable, if not extravagant. The Senate offered standard honours. A few speeches were made. The poets did their duty. One called him a pillar of the Republic. Another called him the last of a generation. Both were wrong, but neither were contested. Years later, his name would appear briefly in a marginal note in a historian's work, misstated, slightly misspelled. A statue in the Forum, funded by his son, would be repurposed during a later crisis. The fountain he built dried up. The temple was rededicated to a newer deity. The legacy he'd fought for, manoeuvred for, sacrificed friendships for. It crumbled, as all things Roman eventually did, not with a sledgehammer, but with time. Chapter 10, The Slow Death of the Roman Senate, for an empire so famously dramatic. Gladiators, poisonings, volcanic eruptions. It's ironic that the death of one of its most iconic institutions, the Roman Senate, was so uneventful. No fiery rebellion, no mass resignation, no final, thunderous oration that echoed through the marble halls of history. Just a slow withering, like ivy choking the very columns it once adorned. It's almost poetic if it weren't so pitiful. You see, by the 3rd century CE, the Senate wasn't just declining, it was decaying. It had all the grand buildings, the titles, the ceremonies, but none of the power. A beautiful corpse dressed in purple, paraded around to make everyone feel nostalgic for a republic that had long since bled out on the steps of Caesar's funeral pyre. Yes, the senators still met. Yes, they still wore the white toga with the purple stripe. But the real decisions, the taxes, the wars, the fates of provinces, were now handled elsewhere, mostly by emperors, generals, and eunuchs behind thick curtains. At one point, emperors had at least pretended to listen to the Senate. Augustus mastered the art of humble tyranny. He let the Senate debate matters he'd already decided. He consulted them while firmly gripping the steering wheel. But by the time we reached the crisis of the 3rd century, a lovely euphemism for near-total collapse, the Senate was more like a historical prop, dusted off when convenient and shelved when inconvenient. Let's be brutally honest here. The senators had helped dig their own grave. For centuries, they'd traded influence for safety, principles for privileges. They'd allowed themselves to be sidelined in exchange for tax exemptions, prestige, and the comfort of not being the guy dragged from the forum and strangled in public for opposing an emperor's cousin. Cowardice wrapped in ceremony. Rome's elite class, once supposedly the Republic's most honourable guardians, had grown far too comfortable in the shade of tyranny. And while the senators reclined on couches, discussing Plato between sips of overpriced Falernian wine, the world changed around them. The army became kingmaker. The provinces gained more power. The emperors stopped even pretending to hail from Rome. Many weren't even Italian. Imagine the scandal at your local bathhouse. A senator would sneer at a Syrian-born emperor while sipping wine imported from the same region. The irony was lost on no one but the senators themselves. By the time Diocletian split the empire in half, setting up a second capital in the east, the Senate had essentially been reduced to a ceremonial club. Sure, you could still get a fancy statue erected in your honour, assuming you hadn't offended the wrong eunuch or tax collector, but real legislative clout? Gone. The Senate had all the authority of a retired librarian shouting at a nightclub. Some still clung to their delusions of importance. Others quietly began focusing on their estates, their villas, and whatever philosophical comfort they could find in the Stoics. After all, if you're going to be powerless, you might as well look wise while doing it. Meanwhile, the Senate's own building, the Curia Julia, started falling into disrepair. Sometimes it burned. Sometimes it got remodeled. Sometimes it just sat there, empty and echoing. By the late 4th century, when the Western Roman Empire was a patchwork of mutinous generals and bankrupt treasuries, the Senate still existed, technically, but it had become like the ghost of a famous actor, still recognized, still quoted, but no longer relevant. Even the mob, once so crucial to Roman politics, barely noticed when the Senate spoke. They were more concerned with food shortages, collapsing aqueducts, and whether or not their town would be sacked by barbarians next week. And speaking of barbarians, let's not forget that when Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, a date that sent tremors through the civilized world, the Senate didn't lead resistance. It didn't organize a defense. It didn't stand on the steps of the Curia and shout noble defiance. Most senators either fled or bribed the invaders to spare their homes. Those lofty ideals about dying for the Republic, they dissolved quickly when faced with the sound of Visigoth axes splintering doors. Even more tragically, or perhaps fittingly, the Senate lingered on in name long after Rome's real power evaporated. There was technically a Senate in the Western Empire up until the late 6th century. It even sent embassies to Constantinople. But let's not kid ourselves, this was no longer the Senate of Cicero, Cato, or even Nero's terrified yes-men. It was a ghostly echo, kept alive for tradition's sake, like a family keeping an empty chair at dinner for a relative who died 10 years ago. In Constantinople, the Eastern Senate fared a bit better, mostly because it had never been as powerful or symbolic to begin with. But even there, it was more decoration than function. The emperor ruled by decree, surrounded by courtiers, advisors, generals, and clerics. A Senate chamber existed, but its debates were theatre, not governance. It was politics as ritual, not policy. And so, we return to a question we've been circling since Chapter 1. What was the point? Why did men like Lucius fight so hard for a seat in the Senate, sacrifice so much, compromise so often, just to end up powerless? The answer, perhaps, lies not in logic, but in legacy. Rome was a machine that fed on dreams of immortality. Even as the Senate's power rotted from within, the idea of the Senate remained golden. It was a symbol of Romanitas, of elite status, of having made it in a world that chewed through emperors faster than marble could be carved. But symbols are brittle, and when reality no longer supports them, they break. The Roman Senate died not in fire or glory, but in irrelevance. It was a slow, sad erosion. 1,000 small compromises, 1,000,000 quiet failures, all swept away by a changing world that no longer needed white togas and lofty speeches. The barbarians came, but they didn't kill the Senate. The Senate did that to itself. And yet, in the irony Rome excelled at, the very institution that collapsed under its own decadence would later be hailed as the foundation of democracy. Renaissance thinkers would look back and sigh nostalgically. Modern republics would model their chambers of power after it. The US, Senate, the French Senat, even parliaments around the globe. Each echo, in form if not in function, that long-dead institution. It's funny, really. The Roman Senate may have failed at ruling Rome, but it succeeded wildly at branding. It's funny how something can die and still speak. The Roman Senate, that grand theatre of ambition and aristocracy, may have vanished from the earth more than a millennium ago, but its ghost lingers, haunting marble halls in Washington, echoing in the hushed chambers of London, creeping into televised speeches that pretend at dignity. The robes are different, the languages have changed, but the performance? Still oddly familiar. And perhaps that's the real trick Rome pulled. Not eternal empire, not everlasting conquest, but the blueprint for how power dresses itself up in procedure and pretends it's noble. Let's be honest, if a Roman senator were teleported into today's world, after the obvious confusion over genes and smartphones, he'd feel weirdly at home. Ceremonial language that masks backroom deals? Check. Elected officials who promise change and then recline into comfort? Double check. Endless debates about procedure while actual crises fester in the streets? Oh, absolutely. It's almost adorable how little we've evolved in certain departments. What's more interesting is the way the modern world has selectively romanticized the Roman Senate. We remember the marble, not the backstabbing. We quote Cicero, not the bribes that got him elected. We celebrate Republican virtue, conveniently forgetting that most senators owned slaves, dodged taxes, and threw parties that would make a frat house blush. There's a curious kind of nostalgia we've built around ancient Rome, like a grandparent whose racism we quietly ignore because he's from another time. But Roman politics wasn't just a different time, it was a warning sign with Latin subtitles. And yet Rome continues to seduce us. From academic robes mimicking the toga, to legal Latin phrases echoing from the mouths of judges who barely know what they mean, the ghost of the Senate endures. Not because it was just, but because it was beautifully staged. The Romans understood better than most that power must be dramatic to be respected. That's why the Senate was a place of marble steps, grand speeches, and carefully orchestrated outrage. It's no surprise modern parliaments have their own version of this. Gavels, podiums, passionate finger-wagging, all designed to suggest that something serious is happening. Spoiler, it often isn't. But let's not fall too deep into cynicism. The Senate, for all its rot, also represented an idea that's still worth clinging to. That power should answer to something more than brute force. Even if that answer came late, was whispered, or was purchased with a coin under the table. The ideal mattered, even when it failed. And there's something oddly noble about a society that kept trying to wrap its corruption in the language of virtue, because that suggests it knew the difference, that it hadn't quite given up yet. Of course, legacy isn't just marble and metaphors. It's also what we don't learn. We inherited a fascination with structure, but not substance. We copied the Senate's form, but forgot the long decay that followed, once senators stopped believing they could be held accountable. Today's legislative bodies might boast transparency, but how many of us actually believe them? When debates become theatre and ethics become optional, we are not so different from the world that watched Nero fiddle while Rome burned. We just live stream it now. Consider also how Rome's obsession with legacy birthed monuments, mausoleums, and mountains of inscriptions, names carved into stone so they wouldn't be forgotten. And yet, they were. The Senate honoured men with statues in the Forum. Most of them now lie shattered, footless torsos whose inscriptions weathered off centuries ago. The families who bribed priests to whisper their names during rituals have long been forgotten. The tombs they built are now tourist attractions with gelato stands outside. Legacy, it turns out, is less permanent than marketers promise. Still, the echo of the Senate survives not in stone, but in structure. In the idea that society needs a chamber where decisions can be slowed down, argued over, diluted, delayed, sometimes for better, often for worse. The Senate taught the world how to stall, how to wrap delay in dignity. And modern democracies, for all their progress, still struggle with that inherited paralysis. We call it gridlock now. Back then, it was called senatorial procedure. Either way, nothing gets done, and everyone claps politely when someone gives a speech that changes nothing. And perhaps the most Roman thing of all? The way we still mistake appearances for effectiveness. A senator in Rome could lose half his estate, be implicated in a scandal, and still command respect if he showed up in a spotless toga and spoke in polished rhetoric. Today, a politician can lie on camera, dodge consequences, and still win re-election by smiling at the right time and quoting the Constitution bonus points if it's out of context. So what are we left with? A ghost story. A long, marble-coated warning wrapped in nostalgia and sold as heritage. The Roman Senate was never a perfect institution. It was often corrupt, self-serving, elitist, and absurd. But it mattered because it tried to be more. At least on the good days. At least until it didn't. Its decline was not a sudden fall, but a slow shrug. And in that, perhaps, lies its most enduring lesson. That power is rarely taken in one dramatic moment. It's surrendered, bit by bit, with each compromise, each excuse, each silence. Lucius. Yes, remember him. He died with a name etched into a crumbling monument, forgotten by his descendants, remembered only here because we dragged him back into the light. He wasn't special. That's precisely why he mattered. He was the average senator, the kind history forgets, but society relies on to pretend everything's still functioning. And as we close this story, maybe we should all ask ourselves, what legacy are we building? And who will mock it in 1,000 years? Because if there's one thing Rome teaches us, it's this. No system, no title, no institution, however ancient, however gilded, is immune to irrelevance. Not even the Senate. And that, dear insomniacs and lovers of inconvenient truths, brings us to the end of our journey through the marbled, moth-eaten corridors of Roman power. If you came here expecting noble senators debating the fate of nations, I hope you leave with something far more valuable, the uncomfortable realization that history rarely lives up to its own press releases. Rome was beautiful, yes, but also bloated, cynical, and oddly familiar. The senators wore togas, but they played the same games we see today, spinning words like silk, selling virtue like wine, and surviving by knowing exactly when to say nothing. Some were heroes. Most were not. But all of them, willingly or not, shaped a world that still echoes beneath our own. If you enjoyed being quietly disillusioned in a historically accurate way, consider sticking around. Here at the Drowsy Historian, we tuck you in with truth, not fairy tales, and remind you that sometimes the best bedtime story is one that leaves you just a little bit disturbed. Sleep tight, and don't forget to question whatever comes wrapped in marble and tradition. Good night.